Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the familiar corner of the room where you listen when the day has finally loosened its grip a little. Because tonight, we're going somewhere that history usually treats as background noise. Not to the tank crews grinding through mud, not to the generals bending over maps under dim lamps, not to the infantry crouched in shell holes waiting for dawn. We're going a few hundred yards behind them, or sometimes several miles behind them, to a place that could smell like boiling cabbage, wet canvas, burned gasoline, coffee, onions and wood smoke all at once. We are going to a field kitchen in the Second World War. And once you understand what those kitchens actually did, how much planning they required, how much could go wrong, and how much a single ladle of hot stew could mean to a tired soldier, you may never look at the phrase army food quite the same way again. Before we settle in, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed with the lights low on a couch after a long day, working late somewhere with this playing softly nearby, or listening from some place I would never think to imagine? I genuinely like knowing. There is something quietly wonderful about people in different rooms, in different cities, maybe even different countries, all pausing at roughly the same moment to think about the same vanished world. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy history when it slows down and pays attention to the ordinary things that were never really ordinary at all, it would mean a great deal if you gave this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Do it when you feel like it. There is no rush here. We're not going anywhere quickly tonight. Now let us begin with a scene that would have been familiar in one form or another across the war. It is early morning, though calling it morning is generous. The sky is still black. The ground is damp. Somewhere nearby, men are sleeping in trucks, tents, barns, foxholes, dugouts, or simply beneath whatever shelter they could find before exhaustion overtook them. A cook is already awake. In fact, he may have been awake for quite some time. He has work to do before the rest of the unit appears with mess kits in hand. Water must be heated, coffee must be made, fuel must be checked, burners must be coaxed into working. Pots must be scrubbed if they were not scrubbed well enough the previous night. Bread must be counted, meat portioned, potatoes prepared, powdered ingredients measured, whatever the day's issue happens to be turned into something that resembles breakfast. And all of it must happen while the battlefield remains a battlefield. Rain does not wait politely until after the meal service. Mud does not stay out of the kitchen area. Aircraft do not avoid rear zones out of courtesy. Shelling does not become harmless because someone is trying to make porridge. When we think about World War II, we tend to imagine armies as machines of movement and firepower. Rifles, artillery, tanks, transport columns, airfields, supply depots. And that is not wrong. But every one of those machines had human beings inside it, and human beings needed to eat at regular intervals no matter what grand strategic operation was underway. A division advancing across France, a regiment holding frozen ground in Italy, a unit preparing to move at first light, a rear echelon workshop crew repairing vehicles through the night, all of them eventually came back to the same blunt requirement. Food had to arrive. Food had to be turned into meals. Meals had to reach men who were often cold, dirty, underslept, overworked, and very far from home. This is the part of war that does not fit neatly into dramatic montage. A field kitchen rarely gets the sweeping music. It is not usually the thing placed at the centre of a movie poster, and yet it sat at the centre of daily military life in a way that almost nothing else did. Orders could change, front lines could shift, units could be attached, detached, rushed forward, pulled back, scattered, reassembled. But somewhere in that confusion, a mess sergeant or a cook still had to ask questions of almost absurd practicality. How many men are eating? How much flour was issued? Is there enough fuel? Can the kitchen truck get up that road? Are the insulated food containers available? Is the water source safe? Can we serve hot food near the front? Or will the tactical situation force us back onto canned or packaged rations instead? During the war, the American Army's own food service materials made clear that when units were overseas, Company mess teams went with them, cooked where they could in rear areas, and tried to distribute those meals forward whenever circumstances allowed. When those circumstances did not allow it, soldiers fell back on operational rations, which were useful, necessary, and deeply unpopular when they became monotonous. That difference between a hot meal and a ration eaten cold from a tin or packet is easy to underestimate from the comfort of a modern kitchen. We are surrounded by food that appears with very little visible labour. Refrigerators preserve it. Shops display it. Delivery drivers bring it to doors. Heating it is often a matter of minutes. In war, especially in a mobile campaign, there was nothing casual about hot food. A hot meal had to be built from decisions made hours, days, and sometimes weeks earlier. Someone had requested the ingredients. Someone had shipped them. Someone had hauled them from a depot. Someone had guarded or stored them. Someone had found fuel. Someone had lit the stove. Someone had stirred the pot while smoke blew sideways and rainwater ran beneath his boots. By the time a soldier received a serving, that spoonful had passed through an entire chain of labour. And because soldiers were soldiers, they complained about the food constantly. They joked about it, cursed it, traded pieces of it, wrote home about it, and gave nicknames to whatever dish had appeared too often or too mysteriously. But complaint did not mean indifference. On the contrary, the more monotonous and exhausting life became, the more intensely men cared about meals. A day could be measured by them. A hot mug of coffee at dawn, a ladle of stew in the middle of rain, a slice of bread soaked in gravy because there was not much else to do with it. Food was physical, but it was also emotional in a very practical sense. It marked time. It gave shape to hours that otherwise blurred into waiting, marching, freezing, loading, unloading, digging, and trying not to think too far ahead. There is a temptation to imagine a field kitchen as a quaint little scene. Perhaps a wagon with smoke curling upward, a cheerful cook standing beside a giant pot, soldiers lining up with bowls and broad smiles. Those scenes existed. Photographers loved them because they made war look almost domestic. They offered a moment of warmth inside destruction. But the reality was more complicated and far more demanding. A field kitchen was not simply a place where food appeared. It was a portable system. It depended on equipment designed to be moved, unfolded, installed, refueled, protected, cleaned and moved again. It depended on cooks trained to prepare food in bulk, rather than in the calm proportions of a household kitchen. It depended on disciplined accounting, because feeding 150 men is very different from feeding 5, and the error is not corrected by casually reaching for another loaf from the pantry. The United States Army's wartime cooking manuals make this very plain. Field cooking used the same basic principles as ordinary cooking, but the equipment changed everything. The cook had to know how to handle wood fires and gasoline burners, had to understand that menus needed to suit the range being used, and had to avoid dishes that required too much time when time was limited. The manual even made specific judgments that sound almost oddly intimate now. Hotcakes, it warned, were poor field choices unless they could be served directly from the griddle, because they required too much individual timing. Hot biscuits were more practical because they could be baked in batches and served more efficiently. This is field cooking stripped of nostalgia. Not what sounds comforting in theory, but what can actually be produced, held, and served to a line of hungry men before circumstances change again. One of the most important pieces of American field kitchen equipment during the war was the M1937 field range, a gasoline-fueled cooking unit designed for versatility and mobility. It could also be operated with wood in emergencies, and its modular construction allowed 1, 2, or 3 units to be installed according to the needs of the organisation. The Army manual described it as suitable for a variety of cooking operations, with a separate fire unit that could be positioned in different ways inside the cabinet or used outside it. It was not glamorous equipment. It was something much more useful than glamorous. It was a practical answer to a question armies had been wrestling with for centuries. How do you feed large numbers of men when the kitchen has to move with the war? That question was not new in 1939 or 1941. Armies had always struggled with food. Roman legions carried grain. Napoleonic soldiers depended on bread ovens, wagons, requisition stores, and whatever could be gathered from the countryside. 19th century armies had camp kettles, ration wagons, and terrible experiences when supply failed. The First World War had already shown that industrial warfare demanded more organised combat feeding. Rolling kitchens prepared food closer to the line when possible, and troops carried prepared meals forward in containers. By the Second World War, the problem had grown larger, faster, and more mechanised. Units moved farther. Fronts shifted more abruptly. Armies relied on trucks, railheads, depots, and carefully managed supply networks. The field kitchen became part of that larger logistical machinery, but unlike ammunition crates or spare tyres, it had a daily human face. Men saw the cook. They smelled the food. They knew when the kitchen arrived late. They knew when it did not arrive at all. Let us linger for a moment on the word field, because it matters. A field kitchen was not necessarily in an open field. It might be set up in a farmyard, a ruined orchard, a roadside hollow, a captured courtyard, a patch of woods, a village outbuilding, or the lee side of a stone wall. The chosen location had to satisfy several competing needs at once. It had to be close enough to feed the unit without wasting precious time. It had to be far enough back to reduce exposure to direct fire. It needed access to water if possible. It needed room for vehicles, crates, fuel, and men standing in line. It needed at least some protection from observation. Smoke, light, and traffic could all attract attention. A kitchen could not simply announce itself carelessly in a war zone. Even food had a tactical footprint. This is why the topic becomes much more interesting the closer you look. A field kitchen was never only about cooking. It was about concealment, timing, transport, sanitation, morale, fuel, menu planning and improvisation. A cook had to think like a quartermaster, a mechanic, a cleaner, a ration clerk, and occasionally a magician. The burner failed. Make it work. The road washed out. Find another way. The food arrived late. Adjust. The men are moving sooner than expected. Serve faster. The vegetables are missing. Make the best of what is on hand. The fuel is low. Do not waste heat. Water is scarce. Save enough for the next preparation and for cleaning. Every meal sat on top of a stack of decisions, and soldiers often saw only the final bowl. There is a reason armies cared so much about getting hot food forward when they could. It was not indulgence, it was maintenance. Men who had eaten nothing but cold packaged rations for days could keep moving, at least for a while, but their satisfaction, energy, and patience wore thin. Army food service histories from the post-war period looked back on this plainly. When conditions allowed freshly prepared meals, soldiers appreciated them. When tactical circumstances prevented them, monotony set in. That word monotony matters. It sounds mild. In practice, it could settle over a unit like a second layer of fatigue. The same flavours, the same textures, the same feeling of eating because one must, not because the body welcomes it. Hot food broke that spell. Even when it was simple, it changed the day. Try to picture a line of infantrymen approaching a kitchen area after a wet march. Their boots are heavy with mud. Their uniforms are creased and damp. Some have not slept well. Some are carrying ammunition or gear that has dug into their shoulders for hours. They hear before they see. Metal against metal. A pot lid shifting. A ladle tapping the rim. Perhaps an engine idling nearby. Perhaps a cook shouting for men to keep the line moving. Then the smell reaches them, and for a moment the war narrows down to the size of a serving spoon. Not forever, not even for long, but long enough to matter. The meal may be stew, beans, potatoes, soup, coffee, bread, something made from canned ingredients and strengthened with whatever fresh food could be obtained. It may not be excellent, it may not be much, yet it is hot, and it was made for them, and that changes its value. There is something almost misleading in the phrase field kitchen, because it sounds self-contained, as though the kitchen itself creates meals out of willpower. In reality, the kitchen was the visible end of a much larger supply operation. The Quartermaster Corps, in the American case, had responsibility for the kinds of things armies consumed relentlessly: food, clothing, petroleum, and other common supplies. Field feeding depended on that broader system working. Standardized menus and ration planning became especially important as the army expanded and many mess sergeants lacked experience in balancing menus and accounts. The solution was not romantic, it was administrative. Units reported the number of meals they expected to serve, and supply points issued ingredients according to standardized menus. That system did not eliminate difficulty, but it made mass feeding more manageable on a scale that would have been impossible through improvisation alone. And still, even with systems, war resisted neatness. Fresh food was preferred where possible, but fresh food required refrigeration, ice, or local purchase, and none of those things could be guaranteed in every theatre or every phase of a campaign. Canned foods filled the gap when they had to. Packaged combat rations filled it when the front moved too quickly, or danger made prepared meal distribution unrealistic. Those rations are often what people remember, because they have survived physically in collections and culturally in jokes. But the field kitchen is where we see what armies were trying to get back to whenever possible. Not simply calories, but meals. Something cooked, something ladled, something portioned with a little intention. That distinction between food and a meal is more important than it first appears. Food keeps a soldier alive. A meal places him briefly inside a human routine. He stands in line. He receives a portion. He eats near others. He may complain. He may praise the cook, though not too extravagantly. He may scrape his mess kit clean and go back for coffee if there is any. Then he returns to whatever the day demands. The routine is short, but it says something plain and necessary. You are still part of an organised world. You have not been entirely swallowed by chaos yet. This is where field kitchens become strangely revealing. They show us war not as a sequence of famous decisions, but as a long effort to keep ordinary bodily needs from collapsing under extraordinary pressure. A battlefield can be won by manoeuvres and firepower, but units are sustained by thousands of things too unglamorous to dominate memory. Water, socks, fuel, soap, bread, coffee, the ability to heat a pot, the ability to get that pot close enough to men before it cools, the ability to do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. There is soft humour in this if you look at it from the right angle, because armies in war can seem almost superhuman from a distance. And yet somewhere in the middle of a major campaign, a mess sergeant is still worrying about whether breakfast will be late because a truck axle cracked, or whether men will grumble because the potatoes are not ready. History sometimes likes to separate the grand and the ordinary as though they belong to different worlds. They do not. They are tangled together. The vast machinery of war could be slowed by weather, broken roads, missing fuel, bad assumptions, or a cooking unit that refused to behave. A battle map might show arrows advancing 10 miles east. Beneath those arrows, men still needed coffee. So tonight, that is where we will stay. Not with the myth of wartime food, and not with the tidy image of a cheerful cook beside a spotless stove, but with the real working world of field kitchens in the Second World War. We will look at the equipment, the fuel, the rations, the men who cooked, the difficult business of feeding troops in motion, the way food was carried toward the front, the problems caused by weather and bombardment, and the quiet morale that came from receiving something hot when almost everything else in life had gone cold. Because the field kitchen was not a sideshow, it was one of the places where an army proved every day whether it could take care of its own. And to understand how it all worked, We have to begin with the thing itself. Not the plate in a soldier's hand, not yet, but the moving kitchen behind it. The truck, the stove, the pots, the fuel, the metal, the smoke, the clatter. The men setting it up in conditions no cookbook ever imagined. That is where we go next. The kitchen behind the meal was rarely elegant. It was not polished wood and shining brass arranged for a museum display. It was steel, iron, canvas, fuel cans, soot, food crates, dented utensils, and men who had learned to make order quickly because the army around them never stayed still for long. When people hear the phrase field kitchen, they often picture one simple wagon with a pot steaming over the back. That image is not completely wrong, but it is too small. In the Second World War, a field kitchen was better understood as a moving cooking system, something that could be assembled on rough ground, loaded onto a truck, secured inside a rail car, or shifted again when the unit moved. It was a kitchen, yes, but it was also a machine of routine. It turned delivered supplies into breakfast, lunch, and supper under conditions that were not designed for cooking at all. The American Army's own wartime cooking manual makes this plain. It did not treat field cooking as a charming improvisation. It treated it as a technical problem. The fundamentals of cooking, the manual said, remained the same whether a cook worked in a permanent mess hall or in the field. The difference was the equipment. A cook had to know how to manage wood fires and gasoline burners. He had to understand that too much heat could ruin food on a gasoline unit, while a wood fire demanded a different kind of attention altogether. He also had to shape the menu around the range in front of him and the mess kit in the soldier's hand. Dishes that required long cooking were a bad choice when time was short. Hot cakes were discouraged unless they could go straight from the griddle to the man waiting, because that took time. Hot biscuits, by contrast, could be baked in batches and served more efficiently. This is the field kitchen in its most honest form. Not a symbol, not a backdrop, a place where every decision had to survive contact with limited equipment, limited time, and a very long line of hungry men. That manual also reveals something else that matters. There was not just one approved object called the field kitchen. There were different ways to feed troops away from permanent installations. The Army described several field ranges, including Army Field Range No. 1, Army Field Range No. 2, and the Gasoline Field Range M1937. It also said that field ranges were used when troops were not equipped with rolling kitchens or other cooking equipment. In other words, a unit's field kitchen could take different forms depending on what was available and how the unit was moving. Sometimes the kitchen was already designed to travel as part of a rolling mess arrangement. Sometimes the cooks had to unload and set up a separate range wherever the unit had halted. The result was not one tidy universal kitchen, but a family of mobile solutions designed to answer the same question again and again. How do you prepare real meals for soldiers when the dining room has been replaced by mud, convoy routes, and whatever patch of ground can be held long enough to boil water? Army Field Range. Number 1 is worth pausing over because it gives us a clear sense of how physical this work really was. Complete with utensils, it weighed about 264 pounds. It was designed to cook for 150 men. At its core were two main parts, an oven and a boiling plate, with attachments that made the system more useful in the field. On the march, it was ordinarily set up by first levelling the selected ground and then placing the oven and boiling plate side by side so the doors aligned properly. Earth might be tamped around the sides to control the passage of hot gases. If the range stayed in one location for several days, cooks could dig a trench beneath parts of it to improve the draft. If it remained even longer, the whole assembly might be elevated on bricks or stones and clay. None of this sounds dramatic until you imagine doing it in poor weather, after movement, while men are already asking how soon they will eat. Setting up the kitchen was labour before cooking even began. There is a detail in those instructions that I find especially revealing. The manual warned cooks not to place heavy loads carelessly on the boiling plate. because they could warp or damage it. It warned against banking the oven too high with earth because the metal might burn through. It explained how the ground itself would heat and dry after the range had remained in place, which could alter baking conditions. This was not the language of a household cookbook. It was the language of operating equipment in an environment that fought back. The field kitchen had to be understood as hardware. It had weak points. It needed care. It had to be assembled correctly, fired correctly, and protected from the mistakes that came naturally when men were tired or rushed. A cook who mishandled his range did not merely ruin a batch of food. He could make the unit less capable of feeding men the next day. The Gasoline Field Range M1937 moved the idea further. Its design was more flexible and more suited to a mechanised army. The manual described it as a range built to perform a variety of cooking operations using gasoline as fuel, though it could also burn wood in emergencies with the help of a collapsible grate. Its modular construction meant that 1, 2 or 3 units could be installed according to the size and needs of the organisation. Those units could be mounted across the front of a 1.5-ton truck, opening toward the rear. The fire unit was separate from the cabinet and could be used in different positions inside it, or operated outside the cabinet when necessary. 3 units latched together could support different tasks at once, with one arranged for boiling and roasting, another for frying, and another for griddle cooking. That arrangement tells you exactly what the army wanted from a modern field kitchen. It needed to travel. It needed to adapt. It needed to produce more than one kind of food without becoming a permanent building. Now imagine standing behind that truck while the kitchen is in use. The cabinets are open toward you. Cooking vessels sit inside the unit. One range is handling a pot that must not be allowed to scorch. Another is being used for frying. A third is giving heat to a griddle. Around it, cooks and helpers move in short, purposeful paths because there is rarely extra room. Someone is lifting lids. Someone is adding ingredients. Someone else is watching fuel pressure, because the M1937 required a procedure before it could safely run. The fuel tank had to be filled. Pressure had to be pumped to about 40 pounds. Valves had to be opened in the proper sequence. The flame had to be watched and adjusted until it burned correctly. Refueling came with warnings. The tank should be filled before each meal, and a full tank would operate the range for about 4 hours. If more fuel had to be added, the flame needed to be out and the burner not hot. The manual did not soften its wording. Gasoline, it reminded the reader, was treacherous if not kept strictly in its place. There is something almost reassuring about how practical these instructions are. They assume nothing magical. They do not pretend the cook is simply a cheerful fellow who stirs soup and calls men to the line. They reveal a worker who needs mechanical judgment, discipline and memory. He has to know the food, but he also has to know the machine. He has to understand flame behaviour. He has to recognise when a unit needs cleaning. The manual ordered daily attention to the fuel jet and careful maintenance of burner surfaces, filters and generator parts. A clogged or dirty burner was not a small annoyance. It threatened the entire meal schedule. A field kitchen relied on flame, and in wartime flame depended on maintenance. That is why the phrase rolling heart of the front feels so accurate. The kitchen moved because the soldiers moved. It had to follow the unit's pace, not its own. It could not demand ideal conditions before it functioned. The army designed equipment that could be placed on trucks, assembled on the ground, or adapted for use in rail transport. The M1937 was considered safe for use on troop trains when installed and operated according to instructions. The manual described range cabinets secured together as a battery against the wall of a baggage car, held in place by chains and blocks. Gasoline cans had to be restricted in number and kept in wooden containers at a distance from the ranges. Fire extinguishers and sand were prescribed. Refueling had to be supervised and never carried out while there was fire in the car or while the car was moving. Even the train kitchen was not a dining car in the civilian sense. It was a carefully managed hazard that existed because troops in transit still needed to be fed. It is easy to miss how radical this was if we look only at the object and not at the purpose behind it. A field kitchen was not merely portable because portability seemed useful. It was portable because modern armies no longer remained in one place, long enough for older arrangements to work reliably. The kitchen had to move by truck because units moved by truck. It had to be capable of going onto trains because troops crossed long distances by rail. It had to be broken down, reassembled and secured because the front was not a fixed camp. The equipment tells us what the war required. Mobility was not just for tanks and artillery. Mobility had to extend all the way down to coffee pots, bread pans, boilers and ladles. And the field kitchen was more than its stove. The manuals list utensils and working tools that make the whole scene much clearer. Boilers and covers in different sizes, bake pans, dippers, skimmers, meat forks, butcher knives, a meat saw, a small meat grinder, steel tools for sharpening, water cans, buckets, stovepipe sections, elbows, guards, and other fittings. The cook's workplace was not one giant cauldron. It was a compact mobile workshop. It had enough tools to cut, boil, roast, bake, portion, stir, serve, and keep the system alive. These objects were not decorative. Each one marked a task that had to be done and a delay that could occur if it was missing. No skimmer when fat rose on the pot. No proper knife when meat needed trimming. No water can when the unit halted away from a reliable source. No stovepipe arranged correctly, and smoke might become a problem where smoke was the last thing anyone wanted. There is a reason armies were so exact about such details. By the height of the war, the United States Quartermaster Corps was handling an enormous range of supplies, and according to its own history, providing more than 24 million meals each day. That number is so large it almost becomes meaningless, unless you shrink it back down to the level of one kitchen crew. 24 million meals are built from thousands of smaller operations, each one vulnerable to minor failures. A truck delayed by a broken axle, a range that will not fire properly, a supply crate that arrives late, a cook who has to change the meal because time will not permit the original plan. Massive military feeding was not accomplished by one grand act of efficiency. It was accomplished by repeating small acts of competence on an enormous scale. That scale also helps explain why standardized equipment mattered so much. When a military organization grows quickly, it cannot depend entirely on whatever clever improvisations individual cooks invent on their own. Standard ranges, standard procedures, standard installation instructions, and standard safety measures created a shared language of operation. A man trained on a given field range could be expected to understand how to set it up, what fuel it used, how it was cleaned, and how it should be secured for movement. That mattered when units relocated, when replacements arrived, and when the system had to keep feeding soldiers even while the larger war pushed constantly toward chaos. Still, standardization did not make the field kitchen neat. It only made it survivable. The kitchen area itself must have felt crowded and improvised much of the time. Food had to be staged somewhere. Empty containers had to be collected. Water had to be kept near the work. Men needed a path in and a path out if meals were being served nearby. If cooked food was being sent forward rather than eaten beside the kitchen, that created another sequence of filling, sealing, moving, and eventually retrieving containers. The Army Food Service record notes that earlier combat feeding practices relied on carrying prepared food forward, and that insulated containers later became part of the solution, because cooking near the fighting was useful only if the meal could arrive in something close to edible condition. By World War II, armies were still wrestling with that same problem in more mechanised form. The field kitchen could move closer than a permanent kitchen, but not every kitchen could be placed close enough to every soldier. This is worth sitting with, because it means the field kitchen lived in a middle ground. It was neither fully rear area nor fully front line. It belonged to the narrow logistical space where soldiers still needed hot food, but the enemy still had influence over how and when that food could be made. Too close to the front and the kitchen risked shelling, air attack, or the disruption of constant movement. Too far back and the meal cooled, delivery slowed, and men at the sharp edge of the fighting received less of what the kitchen existed to provide. This was not an abstract balance. It shaped where the truck stopped. It shaped how early cooks rose. It shaped what meals were practical. It shaped whether men received stew, coffee, bread and something warm, or tore into a packaged ration because no safer or faster answer existed that day. The men who worked these kitchens therefore occupied an unusual place in the army. They were not usually the men whose names appeared in heroic headlines, but they were responsible for one of the few daily certainties soldiers expected. When the kitchen was functioning, it announced itself in small ways. There was the clatter of lids, the knock of a ladle, the smell of coffee or meat or onions, depending on what had come through supply. There was the sight of a cook leaning over a pot with the concentration of someone who knows 100 men will notice if the bottom burns. Soldiers might joke about the cook, grumble about portions, and question the mysterious origin of whatever arrived in their mess kits. But that familiar grumbling depended on a more serious truth. They expected the kitchen to be there. Its presence meant the unit had not entirely lost control of its own life. There is a strange intimacy to a wartime field kitchen that does not exist in most other military equipment. A tank can inspire awe from a distance. An artillery piece can dominate a landscape. A truck convoy can feel impersonal. A kitchen, however, immediately involves the body. It deals with hunger, smell, thirst, fatigue, and relief. It has no need to announce its importance. The line in front of it does that. Men standing with mess gear do not gather because they admire equipment. They gather because something hot might be coming, and in war that hope has weight. Look again at the field range number 1, heavy and practical, designed to feed 150 men. Look at the M1937 units latched together on a truck, set for boiling, frying and griddle work. Look at the train installation instructions, so careful about chains, gasoline cans, metal sheets under the range, and supervision during refueling. These are not side notes. They are the anatomy of a system that had to work in motion. The field kitchen was not merely where food was prepared. It was one of the places where the modern army proved whether it understood itself. Could it carry not only weapons but routine? Could it move not only men but meals? Could it preserve a small piece of ordinary life without pretending the war around it had stopped? The answer, when things worked, was yes. Not perfectly, not comfortably. But often enough that thousands upon thousands of soldiers remembered the sight of steam rising from a pot as vividly as almost anything else behind the line. And beneath all of that steel and discipline sat the next problem. The one every cook faced before the first real batch of food could be trusted to the pot. The kitchen could be mounted, secured, unloaded and arranged with military precision. The tools could be counted. The water could be fetched. The ingredients could be waiting. None of it mattered until the heat behaved. Fire, fuel, smoke, pressure, damp wood, sputtering burners, and the constant need to produce enough heat without wasting what little you had would decide what happened next. The first problem with feeding an army far from home was not food, it was heat. Before anyone could boil coffee, soften dehydrated vegetables, warm canned meat, bake bread, fry potatoes, or produce the thick practical stews that appeared so often in wartime feeding, someone had to make fire behave. And that sounds simple until you place it where it actually happened. Not in a tiled kitchen, not beside a reliable gas line, not beneath a roof that kept out rain. It happened in farmyards, under trees, beside roads, behind stone walls, in muddy fields, in the corners of ruined villages, and sometimes under blackout conditions when even a small visible flame could become a problem. A World War II field kitchen might have food, pots and men ready to work, but without controlled heat it was nothing more than an organised pile of ingredients. The American Army understood this very clearly. Its cooking manuals said that the principles of cooking were the same in the field as in a permanent kitchen, but the equipment changed everything. A cook had to know how to handle both wood fires and gasoline burners. The manual warned that men often used too much heat with the gasoline burner and struggled with wood fires when they were not accustomed to them. That single observation tells you quite a lot. Cooking in the field was not simply a rougher version of home cooking. It required a different set of instincts. A household cook might know when a stovetop was too high because the knob had gone too far. A field cook knew because the burner roared harder than it should, because the bottom of a pot began to catch, because the flame colour was wrong, or because the oven was racing toward a temperature that would spoil the bread before the inside had a chance to finish. Gasoline changed the possibilities of military cooking in a major way. It gave field kitchens a portable source of intense, relatively dependable heat that did not require hunting down dry wood wherever the unit stopped. The M1937 gasoline field range, one of the most important American cooking systems of the war, was built around that idea. It was not a stove in the ordinary domestic sense. It was a modular field range with a separate fire unit that could be positioned in different ways inside the cabinet and used for different cooking tasks. One arrangement could boil or roast, another could fry, another could support griddle work. The system was intended to move with troops, to be mounted in trucks, and to keep cooking even when the unit's location changed repeatedly. That meant the fuel had to travel too. The kitchen was mobile because its fire source was mobile. Operating that gasoline unit required procedure, and procedure mattered because gasoline was useful precisely because it was dangerous. The cook first closed the valves, filled the tank, replaced the cap tightly, checked the filter, and pumped pressure up to about 40 pounds. Then the air and fuel were introduced in the proper sequence, a match was held to the burner, and the flame was adjusted until it burned green. The manual stressed that the tank should be filled before each meal, and that a full tank could operate the range for about 4 hours. If refilling became necessary, the flame had to be out, and the burner had to be cool. The manual's warning was blunt. Gasoline was treacherous if not kept strictly in its place. That is the sort of sentence that sounds formal in a technical book and completely reasonable when you imagine a fatigued cook, halfway through a meal preparation, working near a hot burner in a crowded field kitchen, while everyone else wants the food ready 10 minutes ago. There's a tendency to think of fuel as a background matter, something supplied somewhere off stage while the interesting work happens elsewhere. In a field kitchen, fuel was never background. It determined what could be cooked, how quickly, and with how much confidence. The mess management manual made it clear that cooks and mess personnel were expected to see that fuel was available. In established posts, arrangements could be made for coal, wood, water, and utilities through the proper channels. In the field, that certainty dropped away. The chief cook was expected to fire the ranges personally and make sure there was an ample fuel supply. He also had to see at night that fuel remained on hand for the next morning's breakfast preparations. That detail matters. The next day's first hot drink did not begin when men lined up at dawn. It began the night before, when someone looked at the fuel supply and decided whether the morning would start smoothly or with delay. Imagine the difference between waking in a barracks and waking in the field. In a fixed camp, the day might begin with a range that had already been planned for, with fuel deliveries arranged and stores nearby. In a mobile setting, breakfast depended on whether the kitchen had halted in time, whether fuel had arrived, whether the range had survived the road, whether the fire unit would light correctly, and whether the cooks had enough darkness behind them and enough time ahead of them to complete the work. A soldier receiving coffee at first light saw a tin cup fill. The cook saw everything that had to go right beforehand. That is often how military labour works. The simpler the result appears, the more invisible preparation may be hiding beneath it. Gasoline had obvious advantages, but it did not eliminate older forms of cooking. The Army manual specifically noted that the M1937 range could be operated with wood when necessary and that cooks should be trained in both fuels. A wood-burning grate was issued with each unit and carried folded inside the cabinet when not in use. That tells us something important about the uncertainty of field service. Even a mechanised army could not assume that gasoline would always be available exactly where and when a kitchen needed it. The ability to fall back on wood was not old-fashioned sentiment, it was practical insurance. If the truck had arrived, the cooks had food and the men needed to eat, the kitchen had to be capable of using whatever fuel situation reality allowed. Wood fire cooking, though, demanded its own knowledge. It was slower to establish, more affected by weather and less predictable. Damp fuel smoked. Poorly arranged fuel burned unevenly. A cook accustomed to a gasoline burner might underestimate how much patience a wood fire required. The manual's instructions for field ranges show just how carefully soldiers had to shape the fire's behaviour. Long sticks and branches could be pushed under the boiling plate as they burned. If a range stayed in one place for several days, cooks were advised to dig a trench beneath it to improve the draft. For a longer stay, they might elevate the range on bricks, stones and clay, building a more stable arrangement that held heat better and improved baking. The point was not comfort, it was control. When a large oven, a boiling plate, and a line of men waiting for food all depended on the same fire, small improvements in airflow and heat distribution mattered. This is where wartime cooking begins to look less like simple kitchen labour and more like field engineering on a small scale. Men adjusted trenches, draft, fire channels, brick supports and air movement because the meal depended on it. Too little draft and the fire might smoulder. Too much direct flame against the oven and the metal could overheat or burn out. A field range set on ground used day after day behaved differently as the earth beneath it dried and warmed. The cook had to notice these things. There was no thermostat to correct his judgment. If the heat became wrong, the food or the equipment would reveal it later, usually at the worst possible time. And then there was smoke. Smoke sounds ordinary when we picture a campfire. It rises, curls, drifts and disappears. In war, smoke had to be treated with suspicion. The mess management manual said plainly that the tactical situation controlled the location of the field mess. Natural cover was desired to prevent enemy observation of troop concentrations. A well-drained area was preferred, but concealment mattered immediately. The same manual ordered that all possible precautions be taken to prevent the exposure of cooking fires, lights, smoke, and polished metal equipment to enemy observation. Such exposure, it warned, might reveal troop concentrations and supply dumps. In other words, the kitchen did not simply risk being seen, it risked exposing the larger unit around it. The smell of food might comfort tired soldiers, but the sight of smoke rising from a careless position could do the exact opposite. Think for a moment about what that meant for a cook. He was not only trying to prepare food, he was doing it while minimizing visible signs that food preparation was happening at all. He had to work efficiently, but not carelessly. He needed enough flame for cooking, but not so much flame that it announced itself. He needed the kitchen near enough to function, but not in a place that made observation easy. He needed shelter from weather, but also routes in and out for ration details and men collecting food. The best kitchen site was therefore not necessarily the most comfortable one. It was the one that balanced concealment, drainage, access and speed. The history of field kitchens is full of this kind of compromise. Nothing can be optimized perfectly because everything is being done under pressure. Blackout conditions made all of this more difficult. The same manual expected cooks to familiarize themselves with the location of stores so they could find needed items in darkness. It even stated that the cook would learn to taste the various items used so he could continue working during blackouts. That detail is extraordinary, not because tasting ingredients is unusual, but because of what it reveals. A wartime cook might have to distinguish what he was handling with minimal visual help. He might be reaching for stores in near darkness because light itself had become a liability. We tend to imagine the blackout as something affecting cities, windows and street lamps. It also entered the field kitchen. It changed how a cook moved his hands, how he organised his workspace, and how he trusted memory over sight. There is a human moment hidden in that instruction that I find difficult to forget. Somewhere in a darkened kitchen area, a cook is preparing a meal he cannot fully see. He knows where the containers are because he arranged them beforehand. He knows what he is handling because he has memorized the layout, and perhaps checked by touch or taste. He works faster than a novice would, not because the conditions are easy, but because repetition has trained his body. The soldiers who receive the meal later may never know that part. They may only know whether the coffee is strong enough or whether the stew is hot. But behind those small judgments sits a quiet technical competence that kept appearing across wartime service. The field kitchen also had to defend itself from its own fuel problems. Gasoline burners needed cleaning. Dirt had to be removed from burner surfaces. Slots needed attention. The fuel jet had to be cleaned daily. Water could not be allowed into the fuel tank, and if it entered, the fire unit had to be inverted to remove it. These are not colourful facts, but they are essential ones. A burner that worked poorly could delay or compromise an entire meal. A cook's day included maintenance because fire was not simply lit and forgotten. It had to be managed before, during and after cooking. A kitchen crew that neglected the burner was borrowing trouble from the next meal. Wood brought other trouble. It could be damp, green, awkwardly sized, or unavailable in sufficient quantity. When good fuel was at hand, wood fires were versatile. When it was not, they smoked more than they heated and demanded time the kitchen might not have. That is one reason the manual emphasised training with both wood and gasoline. A cook who understood only one form of heat was not fully prepared for field conditions. He might know recipes, ration components, serving order and cleaning procedures, but if he could not make fuel work under changing conditions, the food still stalled in the pot. It is worth noticing that armies measured cooking not only by whether food got hot, but by whether the method fit the moment. The 1941 Army Cook Manual advised that menus should be chosen with the range and service conditions in mind. Some foods were unsuitable when the equipment or timing made them impractical. This is where fuel affected the menu itself. If heat was limited or unpredictable, dishes requiring careful timing or lengthy attention became less sensible. If the kitchen needed to serve quickly, batch-cooked foods made more sense than items that had to be prepared one serving at a time. The food in the soldier's mess kit was shaped not only by supply tables and recipes, but by the fire underneath the pan. That relationship between fire and food also helps explain why hot meals mattered so much when they were available. They represented far more than the calories in them. A hot meal meant the kitchen had found a site, the fuel had arrived or been gathered, the stove had lit, the smoke had been controlled, the cooking had been completed, and the food had survived the short distance from preparation to service. In a civilian kitchen, a bowl of soup may feel ordinary. In a moving war, it was the outcome of multiple small victories over inconvenience. One over weather, one over equipment, one over fuel, one over enemy observation, one over time. It is no wonder soldiers remembered hot food with such intensity when cold conditions or operational movement denied it to them. We often speak about military logistics in large terms: railheads, supply tonnage, convoys, depots, fuel dumps. Those things mattered enormously. But in the kitchen, logistics became immediate. Fuel became flame. Flame became heat. Heat became coffee, bread, soup, meat, potatoes, porridge, or whatever else the meal required that day. A problem at any earlier stage was eventually felt in a man's hands when the mess kit was filled late, lightly, or not at all. That is why cooks, burners, wood piles, gasoline tanks, and carefully hidden fires deserve attention. They were not minor details under the grand story of the war. They were the practical foundation beneath daily endurance. Picture a field kitchen settling into work before dawn. The truck has halted under cover. The range is open. A man checks the fuel. Another moves near the stores in low light without needing to search blindly. Somewhere close by, water waits in cans. A match appears briefly. A flame catches. Pressure builds. The burner begins to sound right. If wood is being used instead, the cook watches the first uncertain rise of heat and adjusts it, coaxing the fire into something useful. Smoke has to be watched. Light has to be limited. Nothing should shine unnecessarily. The battlefield may be quiet for the moment, but no one mistakes quiet for safety. And still the kitchen begins its work because soldiers will wake hungry, whether the night was calm or not. By the time the men arrive, the difficult part of fire has been hidden inside the finished meal. They may smell coffee first. They may hear a lid striking metal, or a ladle scraping the side of a pot. They may say very little because they are tired, or they may begin joking immediately because that is what men often do when something familiar appears in an unfamiliar world. The fire has done its job. It has turned fuel into food and a cold piece of mourning into something slightly easier to face. And once that heat was under control, the next question became unavoidable. What exactly went into those pots, pans, ovens and kettles? What did armies choose to cook when they had the chance? What did they issue when they did not? And how did a field kitchen turn ration scales and supply crates into meals that could hold an exhausted unit together for another day? Once the heat was under control, the kitchen faced a less obvious problem, and in some ways a more important one. What exactly deserved to go over that flame? What should be poured into the boiler, spread across the griddle, tipped into the oven, or stirred in a kettle large enough to feed a company? We tend to imagine wartime cooks deciding meals the way a civilian cook might decide supper, opening a cupboard, seeing what is available, and building something from instinct. But in a World War II field kitchen, the meal usually began long before the cook touched a knife. It began in supply tables, ration scales, distribution systems, prescribed menus, and crates that had travelled through an army's entire logistical bloodstream before arriving at the kitchen area. The cook did not begin with a recipe. He began with what the ration system had made possible. The Army's 1942 Mess Management Manual defined a ration in the plainest terms possible, the allowance of food for the subsistence of one man for one day. That sentence is simple, but it opens the whole subject. A ration was not merely a package, it was a calculation. How much food should one man receive in 24 hours under a given condition of service? Could he be fed from a regular kitchen? Was he travelling without cooking facilities? Was he in combat where a mess truck could not reach him? Was the unit in a relatively stable area where fresh food could appear, or in a situation where every edible item had to survive heat, delay, rough handling and uncertain delivery? The answer determined the form of the ration, and by extension, what the field kitchen could become that day. The field ration system used several categories, and it is worth slowing down over them because people often collapse them all into one vague image of military food. Field ration A was the best case field ration, meant to correspond as closely as practical to the ordinary garrison ration. The manual said it should be issued as often as circumstances permitted. Field ration B followed the same broad idea, but perishable foods were replaced by non-perishable processed or canned products. That distinction explains a great deal. Ration A represented what an army preferred when transportation, refrigeration, procurement, and local circumstances allowed something closer to normal feeding. Ration B represented what a moving army could rely on when fresh supplies were uncertain. It was still meant for organised cooking. It still assumed cooks, fuel, equipment, and a meal prepared in bulk. But it leaned more heavily on foods that could wait patiently in storage and travel without spoiling. That is the first thing I want you to notice. When people picture wartime rations, they often think immediately of cans opened by individual soldiers with pocket knives. That was real, and we will come to it. But the field kitchen's daily world was built more around A and B rations, especially B when conditions were rough. Those rations were not complete meals in the modern package sense. They were ingredients. They were flour, coffee, sugar, canned goods, preserved meats, vegetables in whatever form could be delivered, fats, seasonings, and substitutes designed to fill gaps where fresh items could not travel safely. The kitchen existed to turn those raw issues into something that felt less like supply and more like dinner. The difference matters because it changes how we imagine the cook's work. He was not only reheating military cans, he was interpreting a ration issue. He was looking at what had been delivered and asking what could be made from it in the time allowed. That question became even more important during the war because the army increasingly relied on standardized menus. The quartermaster history explains that the army created many mess sergeants without prior experience in balancing menus and accounts, so it moved toward a system in which units received the same daily menus and supply points, issued enough food to support those meals for the expected number of men. The mess sergeant reported how many meals he expected to serve. The supply system delivered according to that number and the prescribed menu. That left the cook room for technique, timing and execution, but not endless freedom. He could not simply decide that tonight felt like roast beef if the issue said otherwise. There is something almost funny in that, because soldiers often treated cooks as though they personally chose every dull or repeated dish out of spite. Men in line could look at the pot and blame the man holding the ladle, but behind him stood an entire chain of authority and supply. The recipe was not purely personal, the menu was not a whim, the ingredients had not appeared because the cook loved canned tomatoes, or because he felt especially devoted to beans that week. He was working inside a system designed to feed millions of men without allowing each company kitchen to become its own experimental restaurant. The food could still be good or bad. A skilled cook mattered enormously. But he was not cooking in a vacuum. The ration issue itself could also be awkward. The 1942 manual explained that rations were expected to be issued daily in the field, largely to avoid overloading a unit's own transportation. That sounds sensible, and it was, but it introduced constant small complications. The manual admitted that it was often impossible to issue exact allowances to companies without breaking original packages, and that weather, lack of shelter, enemy fire and blackouts made it very difficult to divide foods like sugar, coffee, flour and spices into precise odd weights. One company mess might come up short of sugar while having plenty of coffee. Another might have the reverse. The manual suggested adjustments and exchanges between companies. This is logistics at the level where it finally becomes human. Somewhere behind the front, someone was effectively saying, "We have more coffee than we need, but not enough sugar. Can anyone trade?" That daily issue cycle shaped the pots more than we might guess. A field kitchen did not always receive perfect culinary balance. It received what the supply process could get to it, in the packaging available under the tactical conditions of that day. A good kitchen could smooth many of those rough edges. It could stretch, combine, season and disguise. A poor one exposed every weakness. The difference between a decent stew and something men remembered bitterly for years might come down to whether the cook knew how long to simmer a preserved meat, whether he added the dehydrated vegetables early enough, whether he kept starches from becoming paste, whether he had enough onion or fat to make a bland issue taste like food rather than punishment. The wartime manuals treated these things seriously because the army understood that ration components did not feed morale until someone made them edible. Dehydrated foods are especially important here because they sat right at the intersection of logistics and cooking. A dehydrated vegetable was not glamorous, but it was useful in a way fresh produce often could not be. Water had been removed to reduce weight and bulk, which made storage and transport easier. The Army's manual on dehydrated foods noted, for example, that 1 pound of dehydrated potatoes represented the equivalent of roughly 6 pounds of raw unpeeled potatoes. That is a staggering difference when you imagine feeding troops across oceans, through depots, over damaged roads, and into field kitchens that might move again by sunset. A truck could carry far more edible potential when that food had been stripped of water before it ever entered the supply chain. Of course, the water had to come back eventually. That meant the cook's burden shifted. Instead of moving 6 pounds of fresh potatoes, the army moved 1 pound of dehydrated potatoes and required someone near the front to restore them. Dehydrated foods had to be soaked, reconstituted, or cooked with enough liquid and enough time to become useful again. If rushed, they could stay stubborn and unpleasant. If mishandled, they could produce a dish that felt like an argument between the cook and the ingredient. So once again, the ration did not end the problem. It transferred part of the problem into the field kitchen, where water, timing, and skill would decide whether efficiency became supper. This is why the contents of a wartime pot were so often combinations of preserved meat, starch, vegetables, gravy, and heat. Not because soldiers lacked imagination, but because these combinations made sense within the system. They stretched ingredients. They made efficient use of canned or dehydrated components. They could be cooked in bulk. They could be served from a ladle. They stayed hot longer than delicate foods. They could be varied without reinventing the entire meal. The Army Recipe Manual from 1944 devoted enormous attention to stews, meat pies, ragouts, dumplings, and other large-scale dishes designed for 100 servings at a time. It offered multiple stew variations, including combinations with tomatoes, green peppers, rice, barley, noodles, dumplings, cabbage, and potatoes. Even the titles tell you something. Spanish stew, Turkish stew, stew el rancho. These were not necessarily authentic regional dishes as a civilian would define them. They were practical army attempts to create variation inside a limited feeding world. There is something almost touching about the effort. The army knew men would tire of sameness. It knew that meat, starch, and vegetables could be arranged in more than one way, even when the ingredients were broadly similar. One recipe might turn stew into meat pie by covering it with biscuit crust or mashed potatoes and baking it until browned. Another added rice. Another leaned on tomatoes and peppers. Another called for dumplings dropped on top of the simmering kettle and steamed without lifting the lid. These were meals designed for scale, not for restaurant presentation. Yet within that scale, you can see a genuine attempt to make routine food feel less routine. Try to picture the cook using one of those recipes in the field. The manual's numbers are astonishing if you are used to home quantities. 8 pounds of flour for dumplings, 30 or 40 pounds of meat in a recipe, pounds of onions, gallons of liquid. No sprinkling from a delicate herb jar while leaning over a polished counter. He is measuring in scoops, dippers, cans, and mess kit spoons. He's thinking about 100 mouths. He's trying to keep the kettle hot enough without scorching the bottom. Men may already be nearby. Someone may be late returning from a detail. Someone else wants to know whether the food can be packed into containers and sent forward. A civilian recipe invites patience. An army recipe assumes that the food must come out correctly, because there may not be another chance today. Coffee deserves its own moment because it appears almost everywhere in this story. The field ration system repeatedly made room for it. C-ration included soluble coffee with crackers, sugar, and candy. K-ration breakfast units included soluble coffee and sugar. The World War I reserve ration had already evolved toward using soluble coffee rather than ground coffee, and that preference carried into later operational feeding because it saved time and simplified preparation. This makes perfect sense. Coffee was warm, familiar, fast, and psychologically larger than its ingredients. It did not solve exhaustion, but it gave tired men something recognizable to hold. In the field kitchen, a boiler of coffee could become the first sign that the day had officially begun, or that the worst part of a cold wait had briefly passed. And yet hot meals were never guaranteed. This is where the other ration types enter the room. Field Ration C consisted of previously cooked or prepared food sealed in cans, intended to be eaten either hot or cold. The 1942 manual described 6 cans per ration, 3 with a meat and vegetable component and 3 with crackers, sugar, soluble coffee and candy. Later, Quartermaster History noted that C-ration meat products included items such as corned beef, hash, or spam-like canned meats, and that the meals were not especially well liked despite later improvements. C-ration was not the cook's first choice when a functioning kitchen was available. It was what the system relied on when cooking facilities or tactical conditions made proper meal preparation difficult. That distinction is important because a soldier eating from a C-ration was not necessarily being neglected. He might be exactly where the war made kitchen service impossible. A kitchen requires location, fuel, time, and access. Combat sometimes stripped all four away. A can of prepared food could be carried, opened, and consumed under conditions where a kettle would be absurd. The trade-off was monotony and often disappointment. The can could feed the body, but it could not replace the visible reassurance of a kitchen operating nearby. When men were stuck on individual rations for too long, they felt the absence. Official Army Food Service history states that soldiers grew tired of the limited menu variety. That is a polite way of saying that canned sameness wore on them. Field Ration D was something else again. The 1942 manual described it simply as 3 4-ounce bars of concentrated chocolate. Later, Army history explains the thinking behind it more fully. The subsistence laboratory wanted a compact emergency ration that soldiers would save for genuine necessity, so the chocolate was deliberately formulated to be less tempting than ordinary candy. The idea was not to provide comfort, but survival. In practice, the history notes, soldiers often discarded it. That is one of those military decisions that looks logical on paper, and much less successful once it meets actual human behaviour. Give an exhausted young man a hard chocolate emergency bar that does not taste especially good. Tell him to save it, and then expect him to form an affectionate attachment to it. That was asking a great deal. K-ration was built for another need altogether. It was light, compact, and broken into breakfast, dinner, and supper units. The 1942 manual's listed components make fascinating reading because they reveal what the Army considered portable, durable, and useful. The breakfast unit included biscuits, a can of veal and pork loaf, flavoured malted milk dextrose or dextrose tablets, soluble coffee, sugar tablets, chewing gum, and cigarettes. The dinner unit included biscuits, processed American cheese, a fruit bar, sugar tablets, lemon juice powder, chewing gum, and cigarettes. The supper unit included biscuits, pork luncheon meat, a 2-ounce bar of Field Ration D, bouillon powder, chewing gum, and cigarettes. The manual added that the ration had not yet been standardized and might change as experiments continued. This was wartime food still in development, being adjusted while the war itself was already demanding answers. The K-ration is useful to think about because it shows how different the kitchen world was from the immediate combat world. A K-ration had to function without cooks. It had to be light enough to carry. It had to divide a day into portable units. It had to provide calories, stimulants, something sweet, something savoury, and at least the suggestion of variety. But precisely because it was so portable, it also surrendered what a kitchen made possible. No long simmer, no aroma spreading through a mess area, no pot thickening over time, no cook making a canned component taste better than it had any right to taste. K-ration belonged to movement, patrols, and situations where meals needed to fit into pockets and packs rather than a serving line. The Army also created rations for small groups, such as the 5-in-1 and 10-in-1, which used canned products for groups of 5 or 10 soldiers. Official quartermaster history notes that the 10-in-1 often ended up being fed to groups of 8 because of its low-calorie content. This category matters because it lived between individual rations and the full field kitchen. It acknowledged that troops might be organised in small detachments, in vehicles, or in situations where a company mess was not the answer, but where eating as a tiny group was better than every man living entirely from his own pocket issue. War forced feeding systems to become more flexible, because the battlefield itself had become more flexible. But when the field kitchen was available, the goal remained different. It was not only to issue calories, but to impose a little order on them. The mess sergeant and cooks took a pile of components and created a meal sequence. Coffee was not just powder in a packet, but a hot drink drawn from a boiler. Meat was not only a can, but part of a stew, a gravy, a hash, a filling, or a pie. Flour could become biscuit, dumpling, or crust. Potatoes might be fresh when available, or dehydrated when transport required it. Vegetables could appear as canned goods, dried goods, or part of whatever the ration system had managed to deliver. The kitchen converted military accounting back into human expectation. It restored the idea that food should arrive in recognisable forms, at recognisable times, with some effort made towards satisfaction. This is why the title, Rations Before Recipes, matters. It does not mean recipes were unimportant. They were extremely important. The army devoted manuals to them for a reason. It means the recipe could only begin after the ration had established the boundaries. A civilian cook might think, I want to make stew, and then buy the ingredients. A field cook might begin with issued meat, potatoes in whatever form had arrived, onions if available, flour, fat, water, and prescribed menu guidance, then determine what variation could be executed without wasting time or supplies. The recipe was not fantasy. It was disciplined adaptation, and because food moved through so many hands before it reached the soldier, storage and inspection mattered. The Mess Management Manual devoted an entire section to the inspection and storage of subsistence, covering canned foods, fresh fruits and vegetables, meats, fish, milk, eggs, dry stores, dried fruits and vegetables, and general storage. It instructed the mess officer, and in emergencies the mess sergeant, to receive, inspect, receipt for, and properly store food items. This is another piece of the field kitchen that vanishes from memory because it looks like paperwork and housekeeping. Yet a dented can, spoiled meat, poor storage, or careless handling could undo all the labour that came before. Armies did not merely need food delivered. They needed food that remained safe and usable by the time the range was lit. I want to pause here and ask you something. When you think of a soldier's meal during the Second World War, what image appears first? A metal can opened in a trench, a chocolate bar in a pocket, a line of men with tin cups. All of those belong to the story. But the quieter image of crates arriving at a mess area, of a cook counting what he received, of dehydrated potatoes being restored with water, of stew recipes scaled for 100 servings, of the same basic ingredients being pushed into slightly different shapes so men would not feel they were eating the same day over and over again, that image belongs just as much. It may belong more because the field kitchen was where the army tried hardest to make war feeding feel like life rather than mere endurance. There is also a subtle dignity in the system when it worked. Not luxury, not abundance, dignity. A soldier who received a hot portion of stew with dumplings or a ladle of meat and vegetables over rice was not dining richly, but he was receiving proof that someone had planned beyond the next 5 minutes. Someone had considered the day's calories, the likely number of men, the menu cycle, the transport capacity, the issue package, the recipe, the fuel, and the serving. That bowl existed because a structure larger than the individual soldier had not forgotten that he remained a body with hunger, taste, and limits. The meal could still be bland. The cook could still be cursed. The potatoes could still disappoint. But underneath the ordinary complaints was a real achievement, and when the system failed, soldiers noticed just as sharply. Too many days of emergency rations, too much sameness, cold food when there should have been hot, a kitchen delayed because the daily issue did not arrive cleanly, ingredients distributed awkwardly because packages could not be broken under blackout or shelling. The official manuals do not dramatise those moments, but they quietly acknowledge the pressures that caused them. Feeding an army was never a matter of simply having food somewhere in the theatre. It required the food to arrive in the right form, at the right place, in the right amount, before time, weather, enemy action, or plain confusion spoiled the plan. By the time the food reached the men, much of that complexity had disappeared behind steam. They saw the result. Perhaps coffee, perhaps bread, perhaps a stew thick enough to sit heavily in the mess kit, perhaps a meal improved by an experienced cook who understood that onions mattered more than the supply tables ever seemed to admit. Perhaps a canned component made more tolerable by heat and seasoning. Men talked about the taste because taste was what touched them. But the taste came last. Before taste came ration type, supply issue, storage, daily distribution, recipe choice, fuel, and labour. The field kitchen was the place where all those invisible systems finally became something a soldier could swallow. And that brings us naturally to the men standing nearest the steam. The cooks, the mess sergeants, the helpers who hauled water, opened crates, cleaned pots, handled fuel, served portions, and listened to complaints from men who had no idea how many decisions had already gone into the meal in front of them. The food mattered because it reached the troops, but whether it arrived as nourishment or as another daily grievance depended in no small part on the people behind the ladles. There is a mistake people make when they picture a World War II field kitchen. They imagine the food first, the steaming pot. The coffee, the ladle dropping stew into a battered mess kit, the soldier stepping away with something warm in his hands, and all of that belongs in the picture. But it does not come first. What comes first is a group of men already working before anyone else has begun to think seriously about eating. Men checking stores, cutting meat, firing ranges, hauling water, washing utensils, assigning tasks, counting portions, watching clocks, and trying to turn military supply into something that hungry soldiers will accept without too much swearing. The food was visible. The labour behind it was not. And once you begin looking at the men behind the ladles, the field kitchen stops appearing like a cheerful wartime detail and starts revealing itself as one of the most disciplined, demanding, and quietly important workplaces in the entire army. The army itself did not treat cooking as a minor talent. Its 1941 manual, The Army Cook, said bluntly that the health and contentment of troops depended largely on the quality of the cooking for their mess. It described cooking as an art worth mastering, and noted that the army maintained schools for training cooks. That is worth noticing because it pushes against the lazy assumption that a military cook was simply any soldier who could be spared from something more serious. Officially, the army understood that a good cook mattered. He was not there merely to keep men from starving. He affected whether food was wholesome, whether it was wasted, whether it reached the line on time, whether the same ingredients became a decent meal or a recurring daily grievance. The manual even distinguished between merely passable meals and meals that brought praise from the men who ate them. That may sound almost quaint inside a world of tanks and bombers, but it tells you exactly how seriously the army regarded the emotional effect of food. At the centre of the mess organisation stood the mess sergeant. He was not just the man who shouted instructions near the pots. The 1942 Manual Mess Management and Training called him a key man in any organisation and warned that selecting a random non-commissioned officer for the role would damage the efficiency of the mess. If an experienced mess sergeant was not available, the army recommended choosing an experienced cook, preferably a graduate of a school for bakers and cooks, who also had leadership ability. That detail says quite a lot. The army wanted the mess sergeant to understand the kitchen from the inside. He was expected to know food, cooking, storage, sanitation, organisation, and people. He had to supervise labour while remaining close enough to the actual work to know when something was slipping. The manual's description of the mess sergeant's responsibilities reads less like the job of a simple kitchen supervisor, and more like the management of a small industrial operation. He directed the detailed running of the mess. He supervised the preparation, cooking and serving of food. He kept the building, equipment and surrounding area in sanitary condition. He assigned duties. He maintained order. He assisted with menus and records. He He checked appliances and equipment for shortages or needed repairs. He reported breakages and worked to eliminate waste. That last word, waste, appears again and again in military food documents, because waste in an army kitchen was not merely untidy. It meant fewer usable rations, lower efficiency, and sometimes unnecessary strain on supply. A good mess sergeant had to think ahead. He had to notice the dull knife before it slowed meat cutting. He had to notice that one boiler was being abused before it failed. He had to notice that the men peeling vegetables were falling behind before the entire meal's schedule began sliding backward. There is a kind of power in that role that history rarely lingers over. Not the dramatic power of command in battle, but the daily authority of a man whose decisions affected every appetite in the unit. The mess sergeant might never plan an attack, but if he failed, everyone knew. Soldiers might forgive many things if the tactical situation was bad enough. They might tolerate mud, delay, and cramped shelter because war was war. But a poorly run mess announced itself 3 times a day. Food late, food short, food badly served, utensils filthy. The same mistakes repeated. A weak mess sergeant created resentment almost automatically. A good one made an entire unit feel more competently cared for, even if no one said so in those exact words. That is an inference from the scale of his responsibilities, and the Army's insistence on his importance, but it is hard to read the manuals any other way. Below him stood the cooks, and here again the Army was more exacting than people often assume. The 1942 mess manual said a good Army cook had to possess initiative, be conscientious and reliable, understand the function of foods, know food preparation and cookery thoroughly, carry out instructions and direct assistant cooks and kitchen police. The first cook or shift leader had to be able to prepare every dish called for on the menu and direct the general kitchen operations. The second cook had to be able to carry out the instructions of those above him. These distinctions mattered because a field kitchen was not a place for a man who waited passively to be told every next movement. Once a meal was underway, tasks overlapped. Water might be heating while vegetables were being prepared. Meat might need trimming while pans were being set up. Fuel had to be watched. The first cook had to see the whole picture while his hands were probably still busy with one part of it. The cook's formal duties were also broader than cooking alone. He was told to remember constantly that the food he prepared was the ration of the troops, entrusted to him for preparation and serving. He was to personally prepare all dishes called for on the menu, keep himself and his kitchen clean, eliminate wasteful methods, personally fire the ranges, ensure fuel was available, assume the duties of the mess sergeant when necessary, study the menu, assemble equipment and ingredients before beginning and before closing at night, make sure food was stored, fuel was on hand, and preparations for breakfast had been advanced. Read that slowly, and you begin to see why the cook's workday did not fit neatly between meal bells. Breakfast required labour the night before. Supper ended with planning for morning. The kitchen's clock bent around the soldier's clock rather than matching it. That is the hidden rhythm of the job. Men outside the kitchen experienced meals as interruptions in their duties. Men inside the kitchen experienced the day as a sequence of deadlines. Breakfast was not simply breakfast. It was the first deadline. Then came cleaning, receiving or organising supplies, preparing for the next meal, possibly adjusting to a changed menu or changed movement order, then serving again, then cleaning again, then securing food and equipment for the night, then getting ready for the next day before sleep became possible. The manuals do not dramatise this, because manuals rarely dramatise anything, but their instructions leave little doubt about the pace. The kitchen could not wake when the company woke. It had to be ahead of the company. And then there were the men whose labour was most likely to be remembered with a groan by anyone who wore a uniform, kitchen police. KP duty has become a comic shorthand in later memory, something associated with peeling potatoes until one's hands lose feeling and scrubbing pans while others rest. The comedy has truth in it, but the Army's wartime guidance was surprisingly protective of the role. Mess management and training said kitchen police was an important military duty. Commanders were warned not to select the most incompetent men for it. It should never be regarded as a punishment detail. The manual was explicit that the man inept at drill or other duties was not necessarily the man to trust in a kitchen, where the health of troops was involved. It even stated that cooks did not have time to prod kitchen police at the expense of their more important work, and that KP men should not have longer hours, shorter holidays, or lower standing than general duty men. That is not how the role is usually remembered, but it is how the army officially wanted it understood. Their actual work was essential. Kitchen police assisted in keeping the mess and utensils scrupulously clean. They helped prepare foods before cooking by washing, peeling and slicing fruits and vegetables. They assisted in serving food under the supervision of the mess sergeant. They helped receive and store subsistence. If the field kitchen was the engine of daily feeding, KP men were part of the hand labour that kept the engine from stalling. A cook could not simultaneously fire the range, manage a boiling pot, inspect stores, peel 50 pounds of potatoes, wash utensils, fill serving lines, and haul every crate that arrived. Somebody had to do the repetitive, unglamorous work that made skilled cooking possible. The army understood that, even if soldiers themselves sometimes cursed the assignment. There is a reason kitchen labour appears so often in memory as unpleasant. It was repetitive, wet, greasy, and hard to escape once assigned. A dirty pot did not become more charming because it had fed soldiers. It still needed to be scraped. Vegetables did not wash themselves because the unit had marched all day. They still came from sacks caked with soil or dust. Utensils had to be cleaned whether rain fell or not, and the greater the number of men fed, the more quickly small messes became large ones. One greasy pan is a household annoyance. A row of huge vessels, each used to feed scores of soldiers, is a minor campaign of its own. The manual's insistence on cleanliness and sanitation was not fussy. It was necessary. A kitchen that let grime accumulate could undermine the health of the very troops it existed to sustain. The cook himself was expected to think like a craftsman. The army cook praised planning ahead, warning that a thoughtless cook left a trail of unnecessarily soiled utensils behind him and thereby earned the resentment of kitchen police. That is such a wonderfully human sentence. It is not abstract doctrine. It is a small snapshot from the daily life of a military kitchen. One cook uses every pot within reach because he has not planned his sequence of work. Another organises his ingredients and steps carefully, producing the same meal with fewer needless dishes. One leaves KP men cursing his name under their breath, the other does not. Even in an army, efficiency could be felt personally. Planning mattered in other ways too. The cook was expected to inspect foods in the absence of the mess sergeant, receive them, sign for them, and store them properly. The manual instructed mess personnel to reject food that was rotten, mouldy, insect-infested, musty, decomposed, or otherwise unsound. They were to check quantity, weight, and measure, and note discrepancies before accepting deliveries. This was not paperwork detached from the meal. It was the first line of defence against bad food reaching the pot. In the field, where supply conditions could already be imperfect, a cook who knew how to inspect and store food protected both the mess and the men. The role demanded a kind of seriousness that is easy to miss because kitchens are familiar. We all think we understand food work because we have stood near a stove or washed a dish. But feeding a military unit was not just domestic cooking at a larger scale. It was regulated production under constraint. The cook had to know that perishables spoil and must be used promptly. He had to understand that canned meat behaved differently from fresh meat. He had to know how to cut meat efficiently, how to season food without ruining it, how to handle dry milk and powdered eggs, how to serve hot foods truly hot and cold, foods properly chilled when conditions allowed. The army manuals are filled with these details because it did not consider them optional niceties. They were part of the technical skill of the job, and yet there was still room for pride. The manuals repeatedly appealed to it. A cook should take an interest in his duties and strive to produce the best possible meals to promote health, contentment and pride in the organisation. That wording tells you the army understood something soldiers always understand instinctively. Food can embarrass a unit or strengthen its sense of itself. A badly run mess feels shabby. A well-run one feels competent. The same company can appear more orderly, more cared for and more confident when its meals arrive as they should. That did not mean every cook was beloved. It did mean his labour had a direct path into unit morale. Try to see the kitchen during the hour before a meal. The mess sergeant is moving through the work area, checking progress and perhaps asking a question without needing a long answer. The first cook has already decided the order of operations and is watching timing more than anyone else. A second cook carries out instructions, perhaps managing one dish while the senior man works another. KP men are washing, peeling, carrying, scraping, hauling, stirring when told, and stepping aside when a hot vessel comes through. Someone has gone to see whether more fuel is close at hand. Someone else is making space for serving. If food has just arrived, there is inspection and storage. If the meal is nearly ready, there is the quiet rush to make sure it is actually ready all at once, not one part on time and another 20 minutes behind. None of this is cinematic in the usual sense, but it is motion. It is organisation. It is a practiced choreography built from repetition. The manuals do not describe this scene as a scene, but the duties they assign make it visible. There is also the social position of the cook to consider. He lived close to one of the most immediate forms of influence in soldier life. Men might forget who signed a requisition or who inspected a food delivery, but they remembered who served thin coffee, who made decent gravy, who managed to produce something unexpectedly good from unpromising ingredients. The army manual's praise for meals that bring words of approval from the mess suggests that this response was not incidental. It was anticipated. The cook worked in a world of visible judgment. Soldiers came to him hungry and left with opinions. That kind of work can sharpen a man's pride or wear it down, sometimes both, and the demands changed according to setting. In a fixed post or established camp, there might be a mess building, storage areas, dining arrangements, and more regularity. In the field, some of those structures shrank, shifted, or vanished. The same responsibilities remained, but they had to be carried out with fewer conveniences and more uncertainty. The Army's manuals cover both broader mess management and field conditions, because wartime feeding moved along a spectrum. A cook might 1 month work from a more stable kitchen, and later find himself supporting a unit in a much rougher setup where fuel, water, movement orders, and concealment dictated the shape of the day. The title of cook remained the same. The reality around him could change drastically. There is something worth admiring in the fact that this labour was so carefully formalised. Armies are often judged by their most dramatic institutions, their weapons, their commanders, their battles. But the manuals of feeding show another side of military seriousness. They show that the army thought about whether a kitchen police detail should be treated with dignity. They show that selecting a mess sergeant at random was considered a mistake. They show that a cook was expected to inspect food, conserve equipment, plan his work, reduce waste, maintain hygiene, and prepare for tomorrow before today had fully ended. They show that feeding soldiers was considered a responsibility, demanding training and character, not merely appetite and a large spoon. I want to pause here and ask you something. When you picture the people who kept an army alive, who do you think of first? Medics, perhaps? Engineers? Truck drivers? Mechanics? Those answers are all right, but cooks belong among them more clearly than they are usually placed. They preserved routine, they protected health, they translated supply into morale. They were responsible for one of the few things every soldier cared about every day, whether he admitted it gracefully or not, and they had to do it repeatedly, with almost no room for applause, because if breakfast appeared, soldiers called it breakfast. They did not call it the successful conclusion of a chain of labour that began long before dawn. The men behind the ladles worked in a world where their best efforts disappeared almost immediately. A pot emptied, a serving line moved, men ate, complained, laughed, scraped their kits, and went away. The kitchen returned to washing, accounting, storing, and preparing again. There was very little permanence in the work. A well-cooked meal might be remembered for a day, perhaps longer if it appeared under especially miserable conditions, but usually it vanished into the stomachs of men who had other things pressing on their minds. That impermanence is part of what makes the labour easy to overlook. Yet the army could not afford to overlook it, and its own documents did not. By now, the kitchen is no longer just a range, a truck, or a set of pots. It has become a small human organisation inside the larger military machine. The mess sergeant holds the structure together. The cooks turn ration and instruction into food. Kitchen police provide the labour that keeps preparation and clean-up from breaking down. Others assist around the margins depending on the setting. Together they make one promise to the unit over and over again. When the hour comes, there will be something to eat if the war allows it. And that promise shaped the rhythm of every day more than most official histories ever pause to say. To understand the next layer of the story, we need to follow that rhythm from darkness into morning, through the brief relief of midday, and on toward the evening meal that had to appear whether the day had gone according to plan or not. By the time a soldier saw the food, the kitchen had usually been awake for hours. That is the part easy to miss. Men remembered lining up with mess kits. They remembered coffee, bacon when there was bacon, bread when there was bread, soup when the weather made soup feel more important than almost anything else. They remembered whether the food was late, whether it was hot, whether the cook seemed generous, whether the second man in line somehow received a better portion than the first. But the meal itself was only the last visible moment of a longer routine that began before most of the unit had stirred. In a field kitchen, the day did not start when breakfast was served. It started the night before, when the cook secured food, checked fuel, put the mess area in order, and made advanced preparations for the morning meal because waiting until dawn was already too late. That instruction from the Army's own mess manual is revealing. Before closing the mess hall at night, the cook was expected to make sure that food was stored correctly, that fuel was on hand, and that preparations for breakfast had already begun. It is a plain sentence in a practical manual, but it explains the rhythm of an entire workplace. Breakfast was not a fresh event. It grew out of the previous evening. If dried fruit needed soaking, if stores needed setting aside, if fuel had to be checked, if utensils had to be clean and ready, that labour belonged partly to the night before. The field kitchen lived one meal ahead of everyone else. Men outside it might sleep, write a letter, repair gear, stand watch, or drop onto whatever ground was available. The kitchen crew, before sleeping, had to consider what morning would demand from them. And morning could demand a great deal. The Army sample breakfast menu was more ambitious than the dull stereotype of military food suggests. It proposed fruit, cereal, milk, a main dish, bread, butter, coffee, and sugar. The main dish might be ham, bacon, eggs, sausage, creamed dried beef, fried mush, French toast, hot cakes, or another substantial breakfast item. Bread might appear as toast, rolls, cornbread, biscuits, coffee cake, donuts, or pan bread. The manual did not expect every field kitchen to produce that full range under every condition, but it did show what the Army considered a properly planned breakfast when supplies and circumstances allowed it. Breakfast was supposed to start the day with warmth, calories, and at least some variation. Even the manual warned against serving the same thing on the same day every week. That may sound almost domestic, but the Army knew monotony had a way of settling into men. Now imagine the hour before that meal. It is still dark enough that forms are unclear. The kitchen site may be under trees, against a hedge, in a farmyard, behind a wall, or wherever the unit has found cover. The tactical situation controls the site. The manual stated that the first requirement in choosing a field kitchen location was natural cover to prevent enemy observation of troop concentrations, and it warned against exposing cooking fires, lights, smoke, or polished metal equipment. That means dawn work had to balance two needs that did not naturally agree with each other. The cooks needed enough light and heat to function. The army needed them not to advertise the unit's position. Every flame had to matter. Every unnecessary shine could be foolish. The cook moves by memory more than by sight. Stores have been placed nearby so unnecessary steps are avoided. He knows where things are because he was expected to know. The manual even stated that cooks should familiarise themselves with the location of stores so they could find items during blackouts, and learn to identify materials well enough to continue cooking when ordinary visibility was not available. That detail takes us closer to the actual feel of the job than almost anything else. A cook in a field kitchen was not merely making breakfast. He was doing it in conditions where the kitchen could not always behave like a kitchen. He might work in half-light or blackout. He might rely on the remembered position of a sack, a tin, a utensil rack, a water container. If he paused too often, breakfast slid later. If breakfast slid later, the whole day began with irritation. The mess sergeant's responsibility was bluntly stated. Meals were to be served on time. That instruction is easy to skim past, but it becomes much more impressive when placed in the field. On time did not mean from a fixed cafeteria counter inside a permanent building. It could mean after a unit had moved late the night before. It could mean after ration details had carried supplies back from a dump in darkness using blankets, shelter halves, or other improvised means. It could mean while the kitchen itself had been arranged under cover to avoid observation. It could mean with fuel that needed careful handling and equipment that had to be coaxed into working. The meal clock remained, even when almost everything around it had become irregular. This is why the daily rhythm of the field kitchen is not simply breakfast, dinner, supper. The Army's ration cycle could be prescribed as breakfast, dinner, supper, or as dinner, supper, breakfast, depending on the tactical situation. That line deserves more attention than it usually receives. It means the Army understood that operational reality could rearrange the order of normal life. A ration day might begin with breakfast in the expected way, or the cycle might be shifted because movement, supply, or operations required another pattern. The meal still mattered. Their order could bend. War did not abolish the kitchen routine, but it could force that routine to flex around circumstances that civilians never needed to consider. There is a quiet tension in that arrangement. Men crave regularity in unstable conditions, and meals are one of the strongest forms of regularity human beings know. Morning food says the day has begun. Midday food says the day is halfway carried. Evening food says perhaps for a little while movement may slow, yet the very war that made soldiers need routine could also tear routine apart. The manuals do not dramatize that contradiction. They simply state that the ration cycle would be prescribed to meet the tactical situation. But behind that administrative phrase is a great deal of lived uncertainty. A man might expect breakfast after waking, and instead receive food later because the unit's schedule changed. A kitchen might prepare on one timetable and serve on another. The mess remained a daily anchor, but its anchor line stretched under strain. Breakfast itself carried more weight than we tend to imagine. It was not only the first fuel of the day, it was the meal most directly tied to whatever work immediately followed. The manual described cereal as a fuel food and suggested hot or cold cereal depending on supply, climate, habits, and the need for variety. It described fruit as a welcome starter. It described hot main dishes and varied breads. These are modest observations, but they show that military planners thought about the soldier waking into the day. They did not treat morning calories as an afterthought. A man about to march, load trucks, go on duty, or return to the line needed something that landed solidly. And the kitchen needed to produce it before the day had a chance to interfere. Coffee sits at the centre of this morning scene, and the manual's tone becomes almost personal when it discusses it. Coffee, it said, should be strong and not merely coffee-coloured water. It should be served with canned milk and sugar when those were available. The kitchen utensils used to prepare it had to be kept scrupulously clean to prevent bitter or off flavours. That is a very revealing piece of army advice. Even under wartime conditions, someone thought it worth saying that weak coffee was unacceptable. That does not mean every cup was excellent. It means the expectation mattered. Coffee was not merely a beverage, it was part of what made breakfast feel like breakfast. In cold weather, or before a difficult morning, that distinction could feel very large indeed. After breakfast came the part most soldiers never saw because they were elsewhere. The kitchen did not pause simply because the line had been served. Utensils needed cleaning. Refuse and garbage had to be handled correctly because sanitation in the field was a serious problem. Food remaining on hand had to be stored as dry, cool, and clean as conditions permitted, kept off the ground and protected from dust, insects, sunlight, and weather. If more supplies were due, the mess sergeant or cooks had to receive and organise them. If another meal was coming, which it always was, preparation began again. This is where the daily rhythm of the field kitchen becomes relentless. Every finished meal creates the labour required to prepare the next one. Dinner in the Army sample menu was expected to be substantial. It might include soup, relish or salad, meat, potatoes, vegetables, dessert, bread, butter, jam, and coffee. Soup could be served at the noon or evening meal, depending on which meal needed extra nourishment. The manual described soup as one way of getting men to eat vegetables, and it advised that leafy green or yellow vegetables were valuable for flavour, appearance, and vitamin content. It also reminded cooks that meat was always popular, that many good cuts were ruined by poor cooking, and that it should not be prepared too long in advance. This is the field kitchen trying to preserve ordinary standards inside a military system. The soldier did not merely need calories. The meal needed shape. It needed timing. It needed heat. It needed to be served before its quality collapsed. The manual made one demand that sounds nearly universal. Hot foods should not be lukewarm. Nothing, it said, was more discouraging to the appetite than lukewarm soup and coffee. That sentence belongs at the centre of any history of field kitchens because it captures the problem so neatly. A field kitchen could do everything right during preparation and still fail emotionally if the food reached the men half cold. The distance between the kettle and the line mattered. Delay mattered. The time between serving the first man and the last mattered. If food had to be carried forward, the challenge grew larger. The cook's labour was only fully rewarded when heat survived long enough to reach the person meant to receive it. This is where the day could become difficult in ways the menu never showed. The manual recognised that field messing depended on local conditions, available resources, cover from observation, and routes to ration dumps during blackouts. Those instructions do not describe a specific bombardment, but they make it reasonable to understand why military operations could delay, redirect or complicate meal service. If the unit moved unexpectedly, if enemy observation made fires risky, if supplies had to come back under blackout conditions, the kitchen timetable had to absorb the shock. That is an inference from the manual's emphasis on tactical control over mess location and ration sequencing, but it is a strong one. The field kitchen served on a schedule, yet the battlefield had the final veto. By evening, the emotional weight of food often changed. Breakfast was preparation. Dinner was sustenance in the middle of the day. Supper carried the hope that the unit might soon settle, even briefly. The Army's manual said the supper meal had to be heavy enough to keep men from being hungry when they went to bed. It suggested main dishes such as meat with rice, macaroni and cheese, chili con carne, chop suey, creamed meat, thick chowders, baked beans, and similar foods. It also advised using dinner leftovers when possible, either without change or by combining them into something new. That tells us two things at once. Supper mattered because nighttime hunger was undesirable, and the kitchen was expected to practice thrift because food could not be wasted merely to preserve the illusion of novelty. Picture an evening meal after a hard day, not as a universal scene, but as a scene fully consistent with the world these manuals describe. The kitchen has been delayed because movement orders shifted, or because the mess site had to be chosen more carefully than expected, or because ration details took longer moving supplies from the dump in darkness. The meal appears later than anyone wanted. Men are tired. Their faces are drawn in the flat evening light. Some have come from work details. Some have come from positions closer to danger. Some stand without speaking much. The cook lifts a lid. Steam rises. The smell is heavy, not elegant. Beans, perhaps, or chowder, or meat with rice, or something built from what dinner left behind and what the supper menu allowed. It is not a banquet. It is not supposed to be. It is supposed to stop a man from going to sleep hungry. The manual says exactly that. The title of this section speaks of supper after shellfire, and that phrase captures something broader than one dramatic moment. The evening meal existed inside a world where the tactical situation could shape everything about the kitchen, from where it stood to when supplies moved to how the ration cycle itself was organised. Shellfire, air threat, blackout, movement and concealment did not belong to a separate story from food. They pressed on the kitchen from outside. A pot did not become safe because it was nearly ready. A serving line did not become invisible because soldiers were hungry. The meal had to exist within the same risks as everything else. That is why a late supper could feel less like an inconvenience and more like a small restoration of order. There is also something deeply practical in the way the army discussed leftovers at supper. In civilian life, leftovers can carry a faint sense of compromise. In a military kitchen, they were an expected resource. Rice and stewed tomatoes might be recombined. String beans and other vegetables might become salad. Dinner's surplus was not failure. It was material for the next meal. This reuse helped feed men thoroughly, while respecting the limits of supply. It also gave the kitchen another daily rhythm. Meals did not always end cleanly. They fed forward into what came next. Even the menu had memory. The cooks, meanwhile, were never simply waiting between meals. They worked in overlapping circles of urgency. Before breakfast, advanced preparation. During breakfast, serving and immediate supervision. After breakfast, cleaning and storage. Before dinner, preparation again. During dinner, the obligation to serve on time and serve properly hot. After dinner, clean up, adjustment, and supper planning. Before supper, perhaps reworking leftovers, perhaps preparing a heavier dish that would carry men into the night. After supper, the mess had to be put in order, fuel confirmed, food secured, and breakfast quietly begun again. This cycle is reconstructed from the manual's stated duties and meal guidance, but the structure is unmistakable. The kitchen day did not end, it turned over. I want to ask you something now, because this is one of those details of wartime life that changes once you compare it with your own habits. How many times in a normal day do you think about the fact that food arrives at a predictable hour? Breakfast when you decide to make it. Lunch when you stop work. Dinner when the day slows down. We usually experience meals as private decisions or family routines. In a field army, meals were a unit-wide clock. They organised expectation. They offered intervals men could count on, until war made them count differently. The army's own manuals knew this. They insisted on timely service. They warned against lukewarm food. They shaped breakfast and supper differently because the needs of the day were different. Those choices were practical, but they also reveal a deep awareness that men did not live on calories alone. They lived on rhythm. Breakfast before dawn, then, was not merely the first meal. It was the kitchen proving it had stayed ahead of the day. Dinner was the kitchen proving it could continue through the day. Supper, especially when it arrived after delay, strain or danger, was the kitchen proving that the day had not entirely broken the unit's ordinary life. Men did not need the food to be luxurious. They needed it to appear, to be hot if possible, to have enough weight in it to matter, and to tell them in the most direct bodily way that someone had kept working on their behalf while they were elsewhere. And once you follow that rhythm carefully, another part of the story starts to stand out. The field kitchen could plan menus, manage fuel and serve on time. but the battlefield was always ready to interfere. Rain could turn a sight into mud. Snow could stiffen hands and complicate transport. Bombs could scatter men before a kettle reached the line. Trucks could bog down. Fires could be hidden too well to work efficiently or exposed too openly to remain safe. The daily rhythm mattered precisely because so many things tried to break it. That is where the next part of this story goes, into the weather, the mud, the cold, and the violence that turned feeding soldiers from a difficult job into a test of stubbornness. Mud did not care that breakfast was late. Rain did not pause because the coffee had finally begun to boil. Snow did not become less cold because the cooks had worked through darkness to get the first meal ready. And the enemy certainly did not agree to leave kitchens alone simply because they were not holding rifles at the front edge of the line. This is one of the truths about World War II field kitchens that becomes clearer the longer you sit with it. Their work was difficult even when everything went well. But very often, almost nothing went well. The ground turned soft. The weather soaked stores and clothing. Roads became unreliable. Light had to be hidden. Smoke had to be controlled. Kitchens had to be placed under cover, yet still close enough to function. Rations had to be carried by hand from dumps in blackout conditions. And when the fighting became too fast, too exposed, or too dangerous, the hot meal disappeared altogether and soldiers went back to operational rations, not because anyone preferred them, but because the battlefield had refused to cooperate. Let us begin with the ground itself, because every field kitchen had to stand somewhere. That sounds obvious until you imagine the problem honestly. A kitchen needed a site with enough room for ranges, food stores, utensils, fuel, workbenches, serving space, and men moving in and out. It needed access to the unit. It needed a route to the ration dump. It needed concealment from observation. And the Army's 1942 manual added another requirement in language that looks modest but says a great deal. A well-drained area was desired. Desired? Not because the cooks liked dry shoes, though surely they did, but because a kitchen set in wet or muddy ground became harder to organise, harder to keep clean, and harder to use without turning every movement into an effort. The same manual insisted that stores be protected from dust, insects, sunlight, and inclement weather, and that garbage areas be well drained and repeatedly policed to avoid contamination and fly breeding. Mud was not just unpleasant, it interfered with sanitation, storage, movement, and the ordinary discipline required to keep food safe. Picture a mess area after hard rain. The available patch of ground might once have been a decent choice. Perhaps it sat beneath trees, hidden from observation. Perhaps the truck could reach it when the earth was firmer. But now boots sink slightly at every step. Water collects in shallow depressions. A crate placed carelessly on the ground takes dampness into its lower boards. Men carrying rations from the dump have to choose their footing. The cook moving between stores and range takes longer than he did yesterday. Garbage and wash water require more care because nothing drains as cleanly as it should. The manual did not write scenes like this, but its requirements make the scene easy to reconstruct. A well-drained field kitchen was efficient. A poorly drained one became sluggish, dirty, and harder to manage at exactly the moment when speed mattered most. This is an inference from the manual's emphasis on drainage, field storage, and sanitation, but it is a very direct one. Rain also attacked the kitchen from above. It threatened fuel, stores, work surfaces, and morale with the same steady indifference. The Army expected field kitchens to rely on tentage when available, and on whatever improvised expedients the available resources and initiative of mess personnel would permit. That phrase, improvised expedients, belongs in any honest account of field kitchens. It means that the official system knew there would be times when the standard arrangement was not enough. A fly might be strung overhead, a tent might shelter the range or the stores, improvised benches might be arranged close to the cooking area to eliminate unnecessary steps. Sacks, boxes, utensils and dry goods had to be kept as protected as possible. The kitchen did not merely cook in the field. It built a temporary little world of order every time the army stopped, and rain tested every weakness in that world almost immediately. The cook's work became more awkward in wet conditions even before the food reached a pot. Stores had to remain dry and clean. Fuel needed attention. Men on kitchen duty moved in and out of the work area, carrying things that became heavier and less manageable when soaked. A lid slipped more easily from a wet hand. A sack of something dry became a problem the moment dampness entered it. Fire behaved differently in cold rain, especially when wood had to be used instead of gasoline. The Army's manuals made a point of training cooks to operate field ranges under different fuel conditions, and that flexibility mattered precisely because field service did not guarantee ideal circumstances. Gasoline burners were more controllable than open wood fires, but they still required careful handling, maintenance, and a safe fuel supply. Wood was useful as a fallback, yet damp wood could mean smoke, delay, and weaker heat. The manuals do not dramatise this, but the equipment guidance tells us why wet weather belonged among the kitchen's persistent enemies. Snow changed the problem rather than softening it. Cold tightened everything. Hands became less nimble. Water froze or threatened to. Roads worsened. Men arrived at meal lines with a different kind of hunger. The hunger produced by cold that seems to work inward from the skin. Official army historical writing on the Italian campaign made this plain. During operations along the winter line, a double coffee allowance was issued, and wherever possible hot meals replaced K or 10-in-1 rations. Another official army account of the same broader campaign noted that divisions suffered from a lack of hot meals and needed rest and replacements to maintain efficiency and high morale. A later army historical study of the 91st Infantry Division in Italy put the matter even more directly, saying that the value of a hot meal could hardly be overstated in the winter conditions of the Northern Apennines. Those are not sentimental remarks. They come from military histories looking back on campaign realities. Cold made hot food matter more, not less. Think about what that meant in practice. A meal that might have seemed merely adequate in mild weather could become deeply welcome in winter. Coffee was no longer just part of breakfast. It was warmth held in the hands. Soup was no longer only an efficient way to combine water, vegetables, and whatever else could be spared. It was heat carried into the body. A cooked meal after hours in snow or mountain cold could steady men in a way that a compact ration could not fully imitate, even if both contained calories. The Army's own food service history says that soldiers overseas ate operational rations when tactical conditions required it, but greatly appreciated freshly prepared meals whenever conditions permitted. In winter, that appreciation sharpened. The official histories of Italy make it clear that commanders and support personnel recognised hot food as part of keeping men effective, especially when cold and exhaustion were already eroding them, and yet winter also made hot meals harder to deliver. A kitchen could cook in the rear area and still face the problem of carrying that food forward, while it remained worth calling hot. The Army Food Service summary states that, overseas, company mess teams went with their units, cooked in the company rear area wherever possible, and distributed food to the front lines. It also states that tactical conditions often prevented the production of freshly prepared meals. That simple contrast tells us a great deal. The system wanted to push hot food forward. The battlefield frequently pushed back. Snow, bad roads, exposed routes, enemy activity, and changing unit positions could all combine to make the ideal meal schedule impossible. The official source does not list every individual delay in every campaign, so it is best to say this carefully. When it describes hot meals as conditional on the tactical situation, it is acknowledging that the environment and the enemy could interrupt the entire chain from kitchen to soldier. The battlefield interfered in subtler ways too. The Army manual insisted that the field mess be placed under natural cover to prevent enemy observation of troop concentrations. It warned that cooking fires, lights, smoke and polished metal equipment could reveal the position of troops or supply dumps to the enemy. That warning is one of the most important sentences in the whole history of field kitchens. It means food preparation itself had a signature. A stove could become a clue. A glint of metal could become a marker. Smoke rising in the wrong place could say, to an observer with field glasses, or to someone directing fire from farther away, that men and supplies were gathered there. The kitchen did not need to be the intended target for carelessness to become dangerous. It only needed to betray the presence of something worth targeting. That is how bombs and shells enter the story of cooking. Not always because an enemy aircraft singled out a stew pot with theatrical precision, but because kitchens existed within a battlefield where concentrations of men, vehicles and supplies were vulnerable once detected. The manual's concern with concealment shows that cooks had to act as though enemy observation mattered every time they lit a fire or arranged an open working area. This is an inference from the manual's warning, and it should be understood as such, but it is the reason the warning existed. The kitchen had to feed the unit without advertising where the unit was. Try to picture the difficulty of that. A normal kitchen announces itself. It smells of food. It glows with light at dawn and evening. It vents heat and steam and smoke. People naturally gather around it. A field kitchen had to suppress those habits as much as possible. It needed to be useful, but not conspicuous. Men could not casually crowd in a visible open space if that space was exposed. Fires could not be allowed to smoke needlessly. Polished surfaces had to be treated with suspicion. Light after dark could not be spent freely. The same army manual that demanded concealment also instructed cooks to know the store layout well enough to work during blackouts, and even to identify ingredients by taste if necessary. That is a level of adaptation modern people rarely associate with cooks, but wartime kitchens had to become nocturnal and disciplined in ways civilian kitchens never did. The route between the ration dump and the field kitchen was another vulnerable link. The mess sergeant was expected to know the location of the regimental, battalion, or similar unit ration dump, so he could direct ration details over the route to and from it during blackouts. Teams of 2 men were to carry rations from the dump to the mess using shelter halves, blankets, or other means, and report the contents of each load so the cook could store them properly when they arrived. This is one of those details that makes the entire system feel suddenly real. The meal did not always arrive neatly by truck to a comfortable loading area. Sometimes men carried it by hand through darkness, in pairs, on fabric slings improvised from items they already had. Supplies moved quietly, carefully, and with just enough order that the cook could turn each arriving load into a planned meal instead of a confused pile. Now place that ration detail in rain or snow. Again, the manual does not narrate a specific storm, so we should not pretend it does. But it does tell us that these movements happened during blackouts, that supplies had to be protected from inclement weather, and that the field mess operated according to the tactical situation. From that, it is reasonable to understand that bad weather made already awkward hand-carrying tasks slower and less comfortable. Blankets and shelter halves could hold weight, but they did not turn a dark route into a paved hallway. Men still had to walk. They still had to keep their loads together. They still had to avoid dropping or soaking what the kitchen would need. A delay there could become a delay in the pot. A delay in the pot could become a late meal for everyone waiting. The kitchen itself, meanwhile, had to remain sanitary under conditions not naturally suited to sanitation. The manual described field mess sanitation as a difficult problem and required every possible expedient to dispose of kitchen waste, refuse and garbage so that flies and disease would not spread. Slop pits and incinerators were to be constructed when the tactical situation permitted. The phrase, "when the tactical situation will permit," returns again and again in these instructions because it ruled over everything. A kitchen might know exactly what proper sanitation required and still have to delay or adapt if the location was temporary, exposed or changing. Yet the burden did not disappear. Food refuse could not simply be ignored because shells were falling somewhere over the ridge. The mess area still had to be policed. Garbage still had to be handled. The men who served meals still had to prevent the kitchen from becoming a source of sickness inside an army already dealing with enough ways to suffer. There is a quiet harshness in that work. We like to imagine that difficult conditions excuse messiness, and sometimes they do in civilian life. But a field kitchen did not have the luxury of giving in completely to disorder. Rain made sanitation more important, heat made spoilage more urgent, mud made clean storage more difficult, which meant the cooks had to pay more attention, not less. Snow and cold could preserve some things, but they also slowed hands and complicated water use. The field kitchen lived in this exhausting contradiction. The worse the conditions became, the more men needed the meal. And often, the worse the conditions became, the harder it was to make and deliver that meal well. Official campaign histories suggest just how sharply troops felt the difference. In the winterline operations in Italy, the army issued extra coffee and pushed hot meals wherever possible in place of lighter, operational rations. In the broader fighting from the Volturno to the Winterline, a lack of hot meals was listed alongside the need for rest and replacements in maintaining efficiency and morale. This is a telling combination. Food is placed in the same sentence as exhaustion and combat readiness. It was not being treated as decorative welfare. It was being treated as part of what allowed troops to keep functioning under punishing conditions. The bitter irony, of course, was that the very moments when hot food mattered most were often the moments when it was hardest to provide. A settled unit in a quieter rear area could receive regular field kitchen service more easily than men engaged in rapid movement or exposed fighting. The Army Food Service history says plainly that operational rations took over when the tactical situation prevented the production of fresh meals. Those rations existed because war sometimes made cooking unreasonable. Yet they also reminded soldiers, by contrast, of what they were missing. A canned or compact ration could be necessary, but necessity did not make it beloved. Freshly prepared meals were appreciated because they were not guaranteed. I want to stay for a moment with the kitchen after shell fire or bombardment had disturbed the larger day, even if the kitchen itself had not been struck. The unit's rhythm would be shaken. Men might arrive late or in smaller groups. A planned serving time might slip. Routes might need to be changed. The cooks, unless ordered to move, still had to find a way to continue. The pot did not become self-managing because something violent had happened nearby. If anything, the pressure increased. Men who had been under fire came back hungrier for the reassurance of a meal, and the kitchen became one of the few places where ordinary action resumed. This is an interpretive reconstruction rather than a direct quotation from one source, but it follows from the manual's emphasis on meals, tactical disruption, and the official history's repeated stress on the morale value of hot food in hard conditions. There is a reason soldiers remembered such moments with unusual clarity in many wartime accounts, even when official manuals only hint at the system behind them. The appearance of hot food after miserable weather or hard fighting told a man that some part of the army still had its hand steady. The front might be confused, orders might change, the road might be cratered or drowned in mud. But someone had found a site, kept the stores dry enough, managed the fire, protected the kitchen from obvious exposure, carried rations where trucks could not conveniently go, and brought the meal through. It was not comfort in the modern sense. It was maintenance of nerve. And there is a small but important humour in the whole arrangement too. The army could plan endlessly for efficiency, write manuals about field sanitation, insist on well-drained locations, instruct cooks how to work during blackouts, and establish systems for carrying rations with shelter halves. Then the weather arrived, and behaved like weather. Rain fell sideways, mud swallowed boots, snow accumulated on canvas. A cook who had carefully arranged his work area one afternoon might discover by morning that the ground had become a different country. Military organisation did not abolish inconvenience. It merely gave men a way to keep working while inconvenience surrounded them. The next time you see a wartime photograph of soldiers gathered around a field kitchen, it is worth looking for what the photograph does not show. You may see steam, uniforms, helmets, cups, and the visible pleasure of men receiving food. But outside the frame may be the muddy path used by the ration detail. Beyond that, the concealed dump. Nearby, the garbage area that had to be kept from fouling the ground. Overhead, low cloud or snow, or the memory of aircraft that had passed not long before. Behind the photographer, perhaps the mess sergeant checking whether the next meal can be made with what remains. The picture shows a meal. The wider scene contains a battle with conditions. By now, the field kitchen has been forced to prove itself against almost everything a battlefield could throw at it without a direct hit. It has had to function on wet ground, in cold, under blackout, with concealment in mind, while rations move by hand, and while tactical conditions threaten to strip away fresh cooking altogether. Yet, there was still one more reason hot food mattered so much, and it had less to do with calories than with what a warm meal told a soldier about his own life. Coffee, bread, stew, and anything served hot carried a meaning that no ration table could fully measure. That is where the story needs to go next. The reason warm food mattered was not mysterious to the men who waited for it. They knew exactly what it did. It changed the body first. Cold hands wrapped around a metal cup of coffee began to loosen. A stomach that had been working on little more than a ration biscuit and impatience finally settled. A bowl of stew, heavy with meat, potatoes, vegetables, or whatever the kitchen had managed to bring together that day, did not merely fill space. It gave a soldier something his body could recognise as a proper meal. And in a war where so much of life had become irregular, dirty, cramped and interrupted, that recognition mattered more than people who have never gone without it usually realise. The army understood this in practical terms. Its own food service history stated that soldiers greatly appreciated freshly prepared meals whenever the tactical situation permitted them, especially after periods of depending on operational rations. It is easy to speak of morale as though it were a vague feeling floating somewhere above the real business of war. In the field kitchen, morale became visible. It stood in line with a mess kit. It leaned toward the smell of coffee. It watched the ladle. It noticed whether the soup was hot. It knew whether bread had arrived fresh, or whether the unit would be working through another day of compact preserved food. A soldier's morale was affected by orders, leadership, weather, fear, exhaustion, letters from home, and the progress of the campaign. No bowl of stew erased those things, but a hot meal could interrupt them. It could create 20 minutes in which the world became smaller and more manageable. The man was still at war when he finished eating, yet for the space of that meal he had not been forgotten by the system that sent him there. That is not sentimentality. It is exactly why military planners kept trying to push hot food forward whenever the battlefield allowed it. Coffee may be the clearest example, because it was both ordinary and intensely valued. The Army's 1942 mess manual spoke about coffee in language that sounds surprisingly serious. It said that, to the coffee drinker, the success of a meal depended upon the quality of the beverage served. Making good coffee, it continued, was an art the army cook had to master. Fresh roasted and ground coffee mattered, storage mattered. Clean coffee-making equipment mattered. Bitter, poorly handled coffee could spoil the effect of an otherwise adequate meal. The manual also warned that nothing was more discouraging to the appetite than lukewarm soup and coffee. That one sentence belongs almost at the centre of wartime feeding. It tells us that temperature was not a minor finishing touch. Heat was part of the meal's meaning. A cup of coffee that arrived properly hot said the kitchen had done its job. A cup that arrived tepid said something had been lost between intention and service. There is something almost humorous in the army formally declaring that coffee must not become coffee-coloured disappointment. But the point was serious. Coffee appeared across ration systems because it was useful. Soluble coffee was included in operational rations because it could be prepared quickly. In a field kitchen, brewed coffee could become the first smell of the morning and the first sign that the day had not begun entirely on the enemy's terms. In cold weather, it meant warmth before movement. After a long night, it meant alertness. At the end of a meal, it stretched the pause just a little longer. The cook might regard it as one more boiler to manage. The men receiving it often treated it as one of the few dependable comforts left to them. The importance of coffee became especially obvious in hard winter conditions. During operations at the Winter Line in Italy, the army issued a double coffee allowance, and wherever possible, hot meals replaced K or 10-in-1 rations. That detail is easy to read quickly and move past, but it deserves more attention. Commanders and quartermasters were not distributing extra coffee because they believed caffeine was a substitute for rest, or because they had suddenly become sentimental about breakfast. They were responding to conditions. Men in bitter weather needed warmth, stimulation, and the psychological lift of receiving something hot. The Army's own campaign histories connect lack of hot meals with strain on efficiency and morale, which means food was being considered alongside the other practical burdens of winter warfare. Bread mattered in a different way. Bread is so common in daily life that it almost disappears from attention until it is absent. In a field army, fresh bread was not a given. It required baking capacity, trained personnel, flour, fuel, transport, and enough stability in the supply line to produce and move it. The Army's food service history notes that during wartime and on manoeuvres, baking became the responsibility of quartermaster field service companies. Army bakers produced bread and pastries, often under arduous conditions, and the resulting bakery products were much enjoyed because they offered a fresh item, as well as needed additional calories. That phrase, fresh item, carries more weight than it seems. Fresh bread broke the sameness of preserved food. It gave soldiers something that felt recent, not merely stored. A piece of bread with stew does not sound like much until you place it in the setting where men received it. It was absorbent, filling, familiar, and useful in the practical ways soldiers appreciate. It could wipe a mess kit. It could thicken a meal without officially thickening it. It could make a thin dish seem more substantial. It could be eaten while standing, while talking, while moving aside to let the next man reach the line. More than that, it belonged to civilian life. Every soldier came from some kind of bread world, whether white loaves, rolls, biscuits, cornbread, dark bread, or something made at home and remembered more vividly because it was gone. Fresh bread did not return him to that life, but it pointed in that direction. The Army may have valued it for calories and variety. The men had reasons of their own. Stew sits at the heart of the field kitchen because it solves so many problems at once. It could use meat, vegetables, potatoes, canned goods, leftovers, gravy and water in a way that made logistical sense. It was suited to large-scale preparation. It stayed hot better than delicate foods. It could be served with a ladle, carried in a mess kit, and eaten without requiring a peaceful dining room. The Army's mess manual praised soups and full-bodied chowders as foods the troops preferred, and it described gravies and sauces as important contributors to the success of a meal. That may seem like a small point, but it revealed something essential. Soldiers did not simply want edible fuel. They responded to thickness, richness, and the sense that a dish had weight. A watery soup might technically be warm. A substantial stew felt like it had earned its place in the bowl. There is also a reason field kitchens leaned so often toward meals that could be described as mixed dishes. War feeding depended on flexibility. A cut of meat might vary. Vegetables might be fresh, canned, or dehydrated. Leftovers from dinner might need to appear again at supper in altered form. Recipes for large-scale military feeding were designed with those realities in mind. The cook's job was to make the resulting meal feel deliberate rather than desperate. A stew did that beautifully when handled well. It hid the hard edges of rationing. It gave different ingredients a common flavour. It allowed seasoning, gravy, and long cooking to improve materials that might have been far less appealing on their own. And because it arrived hot and usually in generous-looking volume, it could create the impression of abundance even when abundance was not truly present. The Army's manuals repeatedly return to appetite, and that is important. They were not written as poetic reflections on comfort. They were working documents, yet they still told cooks to serve foods with contrast, season foods well, avoid monotony, keep hot foods hot, and remember that dessert added satisfaction to a meal. One section stated that frequent serving of attractive desserts, pastries and rolls was an important step in maintaining excellent troop morale. This is not trivial. It means the army understood that men ate with expectation as well as need. A meal could be nutritionally sufficient and still fail to cheer, fail to satisfy, fail to create the effect that made all the labour behind it worthwhile. It is worth thinking about that carefully. In combat, nobody was promising culinary elegance. A soldier did not stand in the rain expecting a restaurant meal, but he still noticed care. He noticed when coffee was hot. He noticed when gravy was smooth rather than greasy. He noticed when bread was fresh. He noticed when the stew had actual substance in it. He noticed dessert when dessert appeared. These things mattered not because they transformed the battlefield, but because they reminded him that some standards remained. Someone somewhere had still bothered to make the meal as good as circumstances allowed. In an environment where much of life felt stripped down to function, that small excess of effort could mean a great deal. This is why photographs of hot meals in wartime settings carry more emotion than they often admit. One official army photographic history captioned an image of tired, dirty, hungry infantrymen eating their first hot meal after 15 days during the fighting at Hurtgen. 15 days. That number tells the story without much embellishment. The meal did not need a menu description to matter. It mattered because it came after an extended period in which ordinary feeding had been broken by combat. A hot meal after that kind of interruption was not just welcome. It was proof that some part of the army's larger machinery had finally reached the men again. Try to picture that scene without exaggerating it. The men are not suddenly cheerful in the carefree sense. They are still worn down. Their clothing and faces show it. They are still in the middle of a campaign that will not become gentle because a kettle has arrived. But they are eating something hot after more than 2 weeks of deprivation from that ordinary experience. A bowl is held carefully because dropping it would be infuriating. A spoon moves with a kind of concentration that appears only when the food matters. Conversation may happen, but perhaps not immediately. Sometimes the first reaction to relief is silence. The official caption gives us the fact. The rest comes from understanding how hunger, cold, and delay work on people. Warm food also marked a difference between merely surviving a day and being sustained through it. Operational rations had their place. C-rations, K-rations, 10-in-1s and other packaged foods existed because a moving or exposed battlefield could make field cooking impossible. But the Army's own post-war and historical summaries acknowledged that soldiers tired of their monotony and appreciated fresh meals whenever conditions allowed. A hot meal prepared in the company rear area and distributed forward represented more than a better menu. It represented reconnection to the unit's normal support structure. The men were not just feeding themselves out of emergency packets. The organisation had reasserted its presence around them. There is a small but meaningful difference between opening a ration and being served. One is solitary, even if men eat side by side. The other is social. A serving line gathers a unit or part of it. Men complain about portions, ask what the dish is supposed to be, try to get more coffee, stand aside to eat, compare whether one section of the line seemed luckier than another. None of that sounds grand, but it restores ordinary soldier behaviour. Men who had spent hours scattered across positions, patrols, vehicles or details briefly come back into a shared routine. The field kitchen made that possible. It gave the unit a place to gather around something other than danger. This is an interpretation grounded in how field feeding operated, but it's hard to understand the morale value of hot food without acknowledging its social dimension. Coffee in the hand, bread torn or folded, stew eaten quickly before it cools. These are modest things, but modest things become large when they're not guaranteed. Most people living in peacetime do not think carefully about the emotional difference between a hot meal and a cold one because the choice is usually easy to correct. If lunch gets cold, it can be reheated. If coffee is unpleasant, Another cup can be made. If bread is stale, there are shops. The soldier in the field had no such casual control. He ate what reached him. He drank what was poured. That is why the quality of a hot meal could echo through the day. It was not one option among many. It was the option that had arrived. I want to pause here and ask you something. Think about the last time you were very cold, very tired, or deeply hungry, and someone placed warm food in front of you. Not a snack, not something eaten while scrolling through a screen, but a real dish that made you stop for a moment. Do you remember how quickly your mood changed? How the body seemed to unclench? How conversation became easier after the first few bites? That response is ordinary, which is precisely why it mattered so much in wartime. The men of the Second World War were not different creatures from us. They were tougher in many circumstances because they had to be, but hunger still made them irritable, cold still wore them down, and warmth still reached them immediately. The field kitchen could not remove fear. It could not guarantee sleep. It could not prevent a march, stop a barrage, or answer a letter from home. But it could make a body feel briefly restored. It could provide coffee that tasted like effort rather than neglect. It could place bread beside a portion and make the meal look fuller. It could produce soup or stew thick enough to feel serious. It could serve dessert or pastries when conditions allowed and, according to the Army's own guidance, strengthen morale in doing so. These effects were small individually. Repeated over days and weeks, they became part of how armies endured. That endurance had a practical side too. Men who had eaten better were more capable of continuing physical work. The mess manual stated that troops in combat, drill, or hard physical labour required more food than those performing clerical duties. That may seem obvious, but it tells us the army was not thinking of feeding as a generic act. It was connected to exertion. Hot, substantial meals helped meet demands placed on men whose bodies were already being worked hard. When histories of the Italian campaign mention efforts to replace lighter rations with hot meals in winter conditions, they are describing more than kindness. They are describing a support measure tied to combat effectiveness. The warmth also made memory. Veterans remembered particular meals because they arrived at moments when the contrast was sharp. Hot coffee in bitter cold. Bread after days of repetitive canned food. Stew after hard movement. A holiday meal under conditions that did not feel suited to holidays. An official image of a tank delivering turkeys to troops, noted in Army Food Service history, reminds us that even celebratory meals were pushed forward when possible, because the symbolic meaning mattered. Not every unit received such things, and not every attempt succeeded. But the desire to provide them tells us that military feeding was never only about biological maintenance. It was also about preserving enough normal feeling to keep men from becoming entirely absorbed by the war around them. There is no need to romanticize this. Army food could be poorly prepared. The 1945 Hennessy Board issued sharp criticism of food service quality, inefficiency, waste, and substandard sanitation in many messes. That matters because it prevents us from turning the field kitchen into a sentimental fantasy. The system had weaknesses. Some meals were bad, some kitchens were badly managed, some cooks lacked training or support, some soldiers had every reason to complain. Yet the existence of that criticism also proves the larger point. The army cared enough about food service to review and reform it. Meals mattered because they had visible consequences for health, efficiency, and morale. So when we talk about coffee, bread, and hot stew, we're not talking about quaint background detail. We're talking about one of the most immediate ways an army communicated care to its own men. A hot meal said that someone had carried the ration chain all the way to completion. It said the cooks had stayed ahead of the day. It said the roads, depots, fuel, kitchens, utensils, and serving line had all worked together long enough to produce something more human than a sealed can. The man receiving it may not have thought about any of that consciously. He may have only said the coffee was good, or asked whether there was more gravy, but the effect reached him all the same. and perhaps that is why these meals remain so easy to understand across time. Battles require study. Supply tables require patience. Manuals require attention. But the relief of something hot in the hands does not require translation. It is immediate, it is bodily, it is familiar. It helps explain why cooks took pride in delivering warm meals forward, why commanders tried to substitute them for packaged rations when conditions allowed, why fresh bread was remembered, why coffee received such serious treatment in army guidance, and why a photograph of exhausted infantrymen eating a first hot meal after 15 days still says more than a paragraph of operational language ever could. By now, the field kitchen has become more than equipment and more than food. It has become a daily reassurance, a tool of endurance, and one of the quiet places where military efficiency met human need. Yet every pot eventually emptied, every coffee boiler ran low, every serving line ended with someone scraping the last usable portion, counting what remained, and preparing to begin again. That final part of the kitchen's work, what was left when the men had eaten and the ground around the mess had gone quieter, tells us perhaps the most about how these kitchens held armies together over the long span of the war. The last soldier in line rarely saw the whole story. He saw only what remained. A cook tilting the ladle a little deeper to catch the final vegetables at the bottom of the kettle. A mess kit held out with the small, hopeful patience of someone wondering whether there might be just a bit more gravy left. A coffee urn that sounded hollow when the dipper struck its side. A piece of bread handed over from a nearly empty container. Then the line thinned, the noise dropped, and the field kitchen entered the part of its day that almost no one remembered afterward. The meal was over for the men who had eaten it. For the cooks, the mess sergeant, and the kitchen police, the work simply changed shape. What remained after service mattered. Pots had to be scraped. Leftovers had to be judged, stored, repurposed, or discarded according to sanitary practice. Utensils needed washing. Garbage had to be separated and removed or disposed of properly. Fuel had to be checked again. Food still on hand had to be protected from weather, insects, dirt, and careless handling. The Army's manuals treated these chores with absolute seriousness, because a field kitchen that served a good meal and then neglected the aftermath was only postponing trouble until the next one. Cleanliness, storage, waste handling, and preparation for the following day were all part of the same job as cooking. The kitchen did not stop being responsible when the ladle stopped moving. There is a particular image that stays with me when I think about this. Not the pot full of stew, because that gets photographed. The pot after the stew is gone. The heavy metal vessel with a ring of food clinging to its inner wall, scraped repeatedly because waste should not be casual and because cleaning will be worse if the residue cools and hardens. Somewhere nearby, men who have just eaten are already moving away into their next duty. The kitchen crew is still there, surrounded by the evidence of what has just passed through their hands. A meal can look generous when it's served. The same meal afterward looks like grease, peelings, lids, spoons, spilled water, ash, and the beginning of tomorrow's labour. The Army expected order in that aftermath. Its mess management guidance insisted that food received by the mess be clean, wholesome, correctly measured, and properly stored. The same attention continued after serving. Remaining food could not simply be abandoned because men were tired. The cook was expected before closing at night to see that food was stored properly, fuel was available, and preparations for breakfast had been made in advance. This made the end of one meal overlap with the start of another. Supper clean-up became breakfast planning. Night became morning's first shift. The kitchen crew lived in a kind of rolling present, always finishing what had just happened and preparing for what was already coming next. Garbage tells us more about military kitchens than it seems like it should. The 1941 Army Cook Manual explained that proper separation and disposal of kitchen waste and garbage was necessary for sanitation and, when useful, for later use as animal feed. Waste was to be sorted according to type. Another Army administration manual likewise emphasised that food waste, burnable material, and tin cans or other metals should be separated, with cans flattened before removal. This is not glamorous history, but it is revealing. The army thought about peelings, scraps, empty cans, and refuse because armies create enormous amounts of all of them. If a kitchen fed large numbers of men several times a day and did not control its waste, it created filth, attracted vermin, invited disease, and left visible signs of disorder. The field setting made this harder. In a permanent mess hall, garbage might move along established routes. In the field, disposal arrangements depended on the tactical situation, local ground, and time available. The manuals described slop pits, incinerators, sanitation precautions, and constant policing of the mess area where conditions allowed. They warned that field sanitation was a difficult problem and that every possible expedient had to be used to dispose of refuse properly and prevent flies or disease. That phrase, every possible expedient, comes up because the army knew the ideal arrangement would often be unavailable. Still, the kitchen could not surrender to disorder merely because it lacked a proper sink and a tiled floor. Think about that after a meal served in rain. The men receiving food may have been impatient, cold, or grateful, depending on the hour. Once they left, the kitchen crew remained with muddy ground, damp containers, refuse that could not be ignored, and equipment that had to be made fit for reuse. The soldiers outside the kitchen returned to the visible business of war. The men inside it dealt with the invisible business of preventing tomorrow's kitchen from starting in yesterday's grime. That labour rarely earned sentimental treatment, but it deserves respect because it sustained the entire rhythm we have been following. Without clean-up, storage, and discipline after the meal, the next hot meal became harder, slower, less sanitary, and less reliable. This is where the phrase held armies together becomes less metaphorical than it first sounds. A field kitchen held armies together not only because it served food, but because it repeated trust. Men came to expect that, if circumstances allowed, the kitchen would be there. They expected somebody to have turned rations into something hot. They expected the utensils to be reasonably clean, the food to be safe, the coffee to exist, the line to move, and the meal to appear again tomorrow. These expectations formed part of daily military stability. They were not as dramatic as orders shouted during battle, but they shaped how soldiers experienced the army as a functioning institution, rather than as a collection of exhausted bodies scattered across a landscape. The scale of that achievement becomes clearer when we look outward from one unit. The Quartermaster Corps supplied the common necessities of army life during the war, including food, clothing, and petroleum products, and the Army's own food service history described wartime feeding as a huge, evolving enterprise that depended on standardized menus, trained personnel, and vast daily provision. Millions of meals did not materialize from patriotic enthusiasm. They came from systems, and those systems depended on the smallest routines being completed faithfully. A mess sergeant reporting meal counts, a cook following the menu within the limits of what arrived, a ration detail carrying loads in darkness, a KP man scrubbing cookware, a baker producing bread under difficult conditions, a supply officer making sure the next day's ingredients existed somewhere down the line. This is also why the army became so concerned when the system failed to meet its own standards. In 1945, it appointed a civilian review board led by John L. Hennessy to examine army food service. The board criticised the preparation and service of food in army messes and pointed to weaknesses that demanded reform. That review matters because it prevents us from turning field kitchens into a comforting myth. The system did not always work beautifully. Some messes were poorly managed, some food was badly prepared, some kitchens wasted, underperformed, or failed to serve soldiers as well as they should have. The army itself recognised that. But criticism of the system also proves how essential it had become. No one appoints a major review board to investigate something inconsequential. There is a balance worth keeping here. We should not romanticise wartime food into endless scenes of grateful soldiers receiving perfect stew under noble skies. That was not the whole truth. Men complained for reasons. Rations could be monotonous. Meals could be late. Cooks could be overworked or poorly trained. Field conditions could wreck any neat plan. Yet we should not dismiss the kitchens as ordinary either. Their ordinariness was precisely their achievement. They brought one of the most familiar human routines into one of the least familiar human environments. They kept reintroducing breakfast, dinner, supper, coffee, bread, leftovers, washing up, and tomorrow's preparation into a world organised around disruption. It is easy to understand why soldiers remembered the hot meal. It is harder to remember the process that made the hot meal repeatable. A single kettle of stew might lift spirits once. A functioning kitchen doing that day after day altered the atmosphere of an entire unit. It reassured men that they belonged to something organised enough to care for them. It made waiting slightly more bearable, cold slightly less punishing, and exhaustion slightly less total. The field kitchen could not promise comfort in any large sense. It could promise a recurring effort. That promise, fulfilled often enough, mattered. Let me ask you something that has followed us through this story from the beginning. What makes a place feel stable when everything around it is not? In ordinary life, it may be a familiar chair, a light left on in a window, a pot boiling in the evening, a meal that appears at roughly the expected hour. In wartime, those things did not lose their meaning. They gained it. A kitchen truck parked under trees, a line of soldiers with mess kits, a cook scraping the last of a kettle while someone asks whether there is any coffee left. These could become signs that the unit still possessed a daily life, however battered and provisional. That is not abstract. It is what routines do for people under strain. The final pot scraped clean also tells us something about thrift. Army kitchens were expected to avoid waste, use leftovers intelligently, and manage supplies with care. Previous meals fed later ones where appropriate. Dinner surplus might reappear in supper dishes. Ingredients had to be measured because food belonged to the ration of the troops, not to casual experimentation. The cook's manual and the mess management manual both stressed careful handling, efficient planning, and the reduction of waste. This was not parsimony for its own sake. It was respect for a chain of labour that stretched from procurement to shipping to delivery, and for the men who needed that food at the end of it. A scraped pot, then, was more than a sign of hungry soldiers. It was also a sign of a kitchen that had portioned closely, served widely, and left little behind that should have reached a man instead. There is something almost ceremonial in the last scraping, even if no one described it that way. The pot has done what it was brought there to do. It carried heat. It held the meal. It passed its contents out one serving at a time, until the need of that hour had been met as fully as circumstances allowed. Then it was washed, dried, packed, or readied again. The routine was humble, but its repetition formed a kind of backbone inside army life. The equipment, too, had to be kept alive. Field ranges required care. Manuals warned that the proper maintenance of cooking equipment could not be overemphasized. The fuel systems needed attention. Burners had to be cleaned. Cabinets, utensils, and ranges had to survive road travel, weather, hasty setup, and repeated heavy use. The kitchen crew did not merely consume equipment in the act of cooking. They protected it because the next meal depended on it. The importance of preventive maintenance appears repeatedly in military technical literature because armies learned that a neglected piece of support equipment could become a problem as surely as a neglected vehicle. And there is another quiet point worth making. Field kitchens connected ranks and duties in a strangely equalizing way. Officers, non-commissioned officers, mechanics, drivers, infantrymen, clerks, communications men and replacements all understood hunger. Their duties differed, their risks differed, their privileges differed. But when the meal line formed, every man cared whether the food was hot, whether there was enough, and whether the coffee tasted like coffee. The kitchen did not erase hierarchy, of course. Armies do not work that way. but it created moments in which the most basic bodily need cut across the unit, and the people meeting that need became important to everyone. This is an interpretation grounded in the universal role of the mess within unit life, but it helps explain why memories of cooks and meals persist so strongly. If we step back from the line, the pots, and the kitchen truck, what emerges is a more complete picture of war. Armies moved through maps, but they also moved through meal schedules. Campaigns depended on fuel, ammunition, bridges, and transport, but they also depended on whether men could be fed in ways that preserved health and kept resentment from settling too deeply. Official histories of wartime logistics stress the enormous administrative machinery required to support modern war, and food was one of the central demands inside that machinery. The field kitchen brought that machinery into intimate contact with the individual soldier. It was logistics made visible at arm's length. A soldier may not have known what depot issued the flour, what office approved the menu, what board later criticised Army Food Service, or how many forms stood behind a case of canned meat. He knew whether he received something warm. He knew whether it came after a miserable stretch of cold rations. He knew whether the bread felt fresh in his hand. He knew whether the coffee helped. He knew whether the kitchen still appeared when the day had gone badly. In that sense, the field kitchen was one of the few parts of the military supply system that spoke directly to the senses, and therefore directly to memory. The last pot scraped clean did not end the day so much as turn it. Cooks checked the fuel. Food was covered and protected. Waste was sorted. Utensils were cleaned. Breakfast was considered before sleep arrived. Somewhere nearby, the men who had eaten were settling back into the conditions the war had assigned them for the night. In the morning, if the roads, the enemy, the weather and the supply chain allowed it, smoke would rise carefully again, coffee would be prepared, and another line would form. That repeated act, practical and imperfect, helped carry armies through the war one meal at a time.